the warm, golden light of ancient Crete, amidst the vast labyrinthine halls of the palace at Knossos, a princess was born. Her name was Ariadne, and she was the daughter of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae, rulers of a land steeped in myth and mystery. Though she was born into royalty, her life would not be one of simple luxury. Her destiny was intertwined with ancient forces, both divine and mortal, leading her down a path marked by love, betrayal, and transformation. Ariadne's story begins with the powerful echoes of the labyrinth, a creation of her father, King Minos, designed to imprison a beast of mythic proportions, the Minotaur. Yet it is not the labyrinth that defines her, but her own journey through it, a journey of profound emotional depth. From the quiet beauty of her first love to the sorrow of abandonment, Ariadne's tale is one of resilience and rebirth. As we journey through the chapters of her myth, we will follow her from her early days in the majestic palace to her fateful encounter with Theseus and her eventual transformation from mortal princess to immortal goddess. Along the way, we will explore the timeless themes of love, sacrifice, and the quiet power of inner strength. Like, subscribe, and share where you are listening from as we gently begin the story of Ariadne, a myth that lingers in the stars, quietly guiding those who find it. Let her journey be a soft companion as you drift peacefully into sleep. In the heart of Crete, beneath the sprawling sky, there stood the grand palace of Knossos, its stone walls gleaming in the sunlight. This palace, a wonder of ancient architecture, was a place of beauty and mystery. It was here that Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae, came into the world. The story of her birth is intertwined with the ancient forces that governed Crete, forces that would guide her through a destiny unlike any other. Minos, her father, was the ruler of the island, a powerful king whose influence stretched across the seas. He was a man of authority and vision, yet beneath his strength lay a tale of divine intervention. His rule, shaped by the gods, had been given to him as a gift that came with both blessings and burdens. His wife, Pasiphae, was the daughter of the sun god Helios, a woman of beauty and mystery whose very presence seemed to whisper of the divine. Together, Minos and Pasiphae created a family that was touched by both the mortal and the immortal. Ariadne was born into this world, where gods and mortals often intertwined. Her birth was marked by the quiet grandeur of the palace, the corridors of marble, and the towering columns that seemed to stretch toward the heavens. In the cool, shadowed chambers of the palace, the air was thick with the scent of myrtle and olive oil, the soft sounds of servants moving about, and the distant murmur of the sea. There, amidst this world of beauty and wealth, Ariadne's life began. Though the birth of a royal child was often celebrated with grand feasts and the sounds of music, Ariadne's arrival was not the cause for grand festivities. Instead, her story began in the shadows of ancient prophecy. Her mother, Pasiphae, had once been caught in the web of a terrible curse. This curse, cast upon her by the god Poseidon, had led to the birth of the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature who haunted the labyrinth of Knossos. It was this creature, the Minotaur, that cast a shadow over the royal family, a shadow that Ariadne would never fully escape. Her father, King Minos, had built the labyrinth to imprison the beast, but no matter how many years passed, the beast's existence hung over their lives like a dark cloud. Yet despite the ominous circumstances, Ariadne's birth was a symbol of life amidst the turmoil of her family's legacy. She was beautiful, with eyes like the sea that surrounded Crete, deep, calm, and endlessly mysterious. Her hair, long and dark, mirrored the rich earth of the island itself, and her skin, pale and smooth, seemed to glow in the soft candlelight of the royal chambers. From the moment she was born, it was clear that Ariadne was destined for something greater than the ordinary life of a princess. In the quiet moments of her infancy, she was cradled in her mother's arms, a symbol of hope for the future. Pasiphae, though burdened by her own inner torment, held her daughter close with a gentle maternal love. King Minos, ever the stoic ruler, would often look upon his daughter with a complex mixture of pride and concern. He could not deny the beauty of the child, nor the strength he saw in her eyes. But he knew, as the gods often whispered in his ear, that fate would not be so kind to his daughter. Ariadne was not merely the daughter of a king and queen, she was the daughter of a curse, a symbol of the tangled web of divine will that shaped the lives of the royal family. Despite the looming shadow of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, Ariadne's early years were peaceful. She grew up in the splendor of the palace, surrounded by the finest of everything: silk tapestries, polished bronze vessels, and fragrant flowers brought from every corner of the Mediterranean. But even in this world of luxury, Ariadne was not blind to the secrets of her family. She would hear the whispers of the servants, the quiet talk of the guards, and the hushed conversations between her parents, their voices thick with tension. The labyrinth, the Minotaur, and the demands of the gods were never far from their minds. As she grew older, Ariadne began to sense that her life would not be like that of the other daughters of kings. There was a stillness in her that set her apart, a quiet understanding of the world around her. She often wandered the gardens of Knossos, lost in thought as she gazed upon the tall, swaying olive trees and the vast, open sea beyond. The waves crashing against the shores seemed to speak to her, their rhythm echoing in her heart. It was in these moments that Ariadne began to understand the true nature of her heritage. A heritage marked by both divine favor and divine wrath. Yet, even in the midst of this awareness, Ariadne's heart was not filled with sorrow, nor was it weighed down by the weight of her family's legacy. There was an air of serenity about her, a quiet confidence that seemed to come from the land itself. She was a daughter of Crete, born of its ancient soil and its mighty gods, and in that she found her strength. But what she did not yet know was that her true journey was only just beginning, and that the path ahead would be one of both unimaginable joy and unbearable sorrow. In the coming years, as the sounds of the waves continued to lap at the shores of Crete, Ariadne's fate would begin to intertwine with the fate of a hero who would come to her in the form of Theseus. But before that moment, before the thread of destiny could begin to unwind, Ariadne was simply a princess of Crete, with all the promise and all the burdens that such a role entailed. Her story was far from over, and though the labyrinth loomed large in her life, it was only the first of many twists and turns that would shape her destiny. And so, as the winds whispered through the olive groves and the sun set over the Aegean Sea, Ariadne's journey, a journey of love, betrayal, and transformation, was quietly set into motion. The labyrinth was not merely a place of confinement. It was a doorway, one that would lead Ariadne into the arms of a hero, into the embrace of the gods, and ultimately into a fate that would carry her beyond the mortal realm and into the stars. As Ariadne grew, the palace of Knossos, with its towering walls and intricate corridors, became her world. Its labyrinthine halls were more than mere architecture. They were a living symbol of her father's reign, of the tension between man's ambition and the will of the gods. To Ariadne, the palace was a place both wondrous and foreboding, where light and shadow danced on the walls and where the air seemed thick with secrets. The labyrinth itself, the grand maze constructed by Daedalus, stood as the very heart of the palace. It was said to be so intricate that even the cleverest of men would be lost within it, never to find their way out again. The legend of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull creature who dwelled within the labyrinth's heart, was a constant presence in Ariadne's life. Though she had never set foot inside the maze herself, she knew its every twist and turn through stories passed down by her father, whispered by the servants, and echoed in the dark corners of the palace. Ariadne's early years were spent in the luxury of the royal household, but even in this paradise there was an undeniable heaviness. Her mother, Pasiphae, though a woman of great beauty and grace, carried the burden of her own divine curse. The unnatural union with a bull that had birthed the Minotaur. King Minos, despite his power, was deeply haunted by the monster his wife had borne, and the labyrinth was his answer to the dark creature, designed to lock away the beast from the world. It was a symbol of both protection and punishment, a paradox that Ariadne could never quite escape. In the quiet of the palace, Ariadne would sometimes catch glimpses of her father, walking with grim determination as he stared at the walls of the labyrinth, as though looking for a way to erase its shadow from their lives. Despite his outward strength, the presence of the Minotaur locked away within the maze seemed to haunt him. It was a reminder of the gods' power and the cost of divine interference. For Ariadne, however, the labyrinth was not a place of fear. It was simply a part of the world she knew, a structure as ancient and as enduring as the island itself. She spent much of her childhood in the gardens of Knossos, wandering among the tall olive trees and fragrant wildflowers that bloomed in the warmth of the Mediterranean sun. The gardens, with their winding paths and hidden corners, often felt like their own labyrinth, a place where Ariadne could escape from the weight of her family's legacy and her own looming fate. In these moments, she felt at peace, surrounded by the timeless beauty of the land. Yet, even in these quiet moments, the labyrinth loomed, both as a literal structure in the palace and as a metaphor for the complexities of her life. Though Ariadne was a princess, she was not shielded from the harshness of the world. As she grew older, she began to understand the implications of her family's history. She heard the whispers of the people, murmurs about the sacrifices made to the Minotaur, the young men and women sent to face the beast, lost forever in the maze. These offerings were part of a tribute that King Minos demanded from Athens, and Ariadne could not help but feel the weight of her own family's involvement in such a cruel ritual. The sacrifices seemed to hang over the palace like a heavy cloud, a reminder that the power of kings and gods was often exercised at the expense of the innocent. Despite her youth, Ariadne could see the bitterness in her father's eyes when he spoke of the tribute, a mixture of power and guilt. King Minos ruled over the island with authority, but he was not immune to the toll of the god's whims. It was a tension that Ariadne would come to know all too well. And as her understanding deepened, she began to question the labyrinth's purpose. Was it truly meant to protect the kingdom, or was it a prison, a symbol of her family's bondage to the will of the gods? In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Ariadne would often sit on the palace's terraces, gazing out at the vast Aegean Sea. The waves, gentle and eternal, seemed to call to her, offering a brief moment of respite from the heavy thoughts that lingered in her mind. She would dream of a life beyond the labyrinth, of a future that was not defined by the curse of the Minotaur. The gods, it seemed, were never far from her thoughts. It was as if their invisible hands shaped the course of her life, pulling her toward an unknown destiny. Yet, despite the shadows that hung over her, there was a quiet strength within Ariadne. She was a daughter of Crete, born from the soil of the island and cradled in the rich history of its people. Though the labyrinth symbolized the confusion and entrapment that marked her family's story, Ariadne was determined to find a way out of its labyrinthine grip. And it was in this quiet resolve that her true journey would begin. A journey that would take her beyond the palace walls, beyond her father's legacy, and into the arms of a hero. In the grand halls of the palace, as the echo of footsteps reverberated through the stone corridors, Ariadne's life was about to change in ways she could not yet comprehend. The labyrinth, with its twisting paths and secretive corners, would soon become a place not only of entrapment, but of possibility. It was here, within the depths of the maze, that Ariadne would find herself intertwined with the fate of a hero who, like her, was destined to change the world. And so, within the palace walls, Ariadne continued her life, caught between the past and the future, the divine and the mortal. The labyrinth, once a symbol of terror and imprisonment, would soon offer her a path that would lead her into the myth that would shape her forever. In the heart of Crete, where the labyrinth twisted and turned beneath the towering palace, a dark legend lingered, one that cast a shadow over the royal family and the entire island. The Minotaur, half man and half bull, was not merely a beast. It was a symbol of punishment, of divine retribution, and the price that must be paid for a king's pride. The creature had been born from the curse of the god Poseidon, who, in a moment of anger, had caused the union between Queen Pasiphae and a bull. This union, unnatural and unholy, had given birth to the monstrous Minotaur. To King Minos, the beast was both a burden and a reminder of the god's capricious nature. The Minotaur's existence in the labyrinth had been a source of shame for the king, but it was also a twisted mark of power. For it was Minos who commanded the labyrinth's construction, an intricate maze of passageways and hidden doors built by the great craftsman Daedalus. It was a place where the Minotaur could live out its days, confined and isolated, yet terrifying in its potential to harm. And yet, the Minotaur was not the only shadow cast over the palace of Knossos. For the beast's existence demanded a tribute, a terrible payment from Athens, a city that had once been ruled by Minos's brother, Asterius. The tribute required the Athenians to send 14 young people, 7 men and 7 women, to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. Each year, this tribute was demanded, a brutal reminder of the power the gods had bestowed upon King Minos and the blood debt owed to them. Ariadne, as she grew, became increasingly aware of the toll this tribute took on the people of Athens and on her own family. She would overhear hushed conversations between her father and his advisors, their voices low and heavy with the weight of their decisions. Though she had never seen the Minotaur, Ariadne knew of its existence, and the fear it inspired was ever present. The idea that young men and women were sent to their deaths to satisfy this cruel demand seemed, to her, to be an act of both divine wrath and human cruelty. Despite the darkness that surrounded the Minotaur, Ariadne's life continued in the bright chambers of the palace. Yet the knowledge of the tribute haunted her. It was a constant reminder of the complex relationship between power, the gods, and the mortal world. King Minos, though a king of great authority, was not without his own inner struggles. The power he wielded came with a heavy price. The Minotaur, locked away in the labyrinth, was a symbol of that price. Each time the tribute came, it reminded him of the cost of his rule and the cost of his own pride. Ariadne could not help but feel conflicted. On one hand, she was the daughter of the king, the royal bloodline of Crete. On the other hand, she was a young woman who could not ignore the suffering that the tribute caused. She would often stand at the palace windows, gazing out toward the sea, wondering what it would be like to be free of this constant cycle of sacrifice and punishment. The waves lapping gently against the shore seemed to whisper a different life to her, one unburdened by the labyrinth, the tribute, and the monstrous creature that lurked within it. But as the years passed, it became clear that this was the world Ariadne was born into, and there was little she could do to change it. The tribute was an unbreakable part of the island's history, woven into the very fabric of Crete's existence. The people of Athens, bound by their own gods and their own kings, could do little to resist the demands that were placed upon them. It was a tragedy, a ritual of suffering and loss, and yet it was also a cycle that could not be easily disrupted. For the gods, it seemed, were always watching, always demanding. And then, in the midst of this cycle, a new figure entered the story, a hero. His name was Theseus, the son of Aegeus, king of Athens. He was young, brave, and filled with a desire to end the tribute and free his city from the grip of Crete. Theseus, determined to rid his people of this cruel fate, set his mind on entering the labyrinth and slaying the Minotaur. When word reached Knossos that Theseus intended to come to Crete to put an end to the tribute, Ariadne's heart stirred. The hero's arrival, though filled with promise, also filled her with uncertainty. She could not ignore the suffering that had defined her life, nor could she remain passive in the face of the terrible ritual that claimed the lives of so many innocent young people. Yet, what could she do? She was a princess, bound to her father's will, her fate intricately tied to the very system she questioned. But destiny, it seemed, was already in motion. As Theseus sailed toward Crete, Ariadne began to wonder if perhaps this would be her opportunity to change the course of her own story. For the first time, the labyrinth, the place of fear, death, and imprisonment, might become a path to something else, a chance to end the sacrifice and bring hope to those who had been doomed to the maze. But to do so, Ariadne would need to act quickly, for her father would not simply allow a foreign hero to come and disrupt the balance of power. Ariadne's heart beat with the possibility of something greater than herself. The Minotaur was not only a beast to be slain, but a symbol of the darkness that had loomed over her family for so long. And now, with Theseus's arrival, the labyrinth might finally offer a way out, not just for the young Athenians who would be sacrificed, but for her as well. The path ahead was unclear, but it was a path she was ready to walk. The day Theseus arrived on Crete, the island seemed to hold its breath, as if the air itself could sense the change that had begun. The hero, son of King Aegeus of Athens, had sailed across the Aegean Sea, driven by a singular purpose, to end the tribute of youth sent to the labyrinth, and, in doing so, to rid Athens of its cruel bondage to Crete. His name, already whispered in the courts of kings and the hearts of the people, now carried the weight of hope. For Theseus was not merely a warrior. He was a symbol of change, of resistance against the dark forces that ruled their fates. Ariadne stood on the terraces of the palace, gazing out at the horizon as Theseus's ship approached the shore. She had heard the stories of his strength and valor, how he had already shown great courage in his youth by slaying dangerous beasts and winning battles on behalf of his city. But none of that prepared her for the first moment she laid eyes on him. It was not his stature, nor the gleaming armor he wore that struck her. It was the look in his eyes. There was a quiet determination there, a deep resolve to succeed in his task, no matter the cost. She had known of Theseus's mission, of course. It was impossible not to. Her father, King Minos, would not allow such an intrusion without careful planning, without ensuring that his prize, the tribute of the Minotaur, was protected. But in Ariadne's heart, a flicker of something unexpected stirred. She was caught between two worlds. On the one hand, she was the daughter of Minos, and her loyalty to her father and his kingdom was a part of her very being. On the other hand, she was a woman who could no longer ignore the cruelty of the tribute, the injustice it caused, the young lives it claimed. Theseus's arrival, though it threatened her father's authority, also carried the promise of something different, something that could change the course of her life. Their first meeting was not dramatic or filled with grandeur, but quiet, almost serendipitous. It happened in the royal gardens, where Ariadne often went to escape the oppressive weight of palace life. There, among the flowers and winding paths, Theseus appeared, seemingly drawn to her, just as she had been drawn to him. His purpose was clear, but there was no brashness in his demeanor, no arrogance in his stride. He was a hero, yes, but there was something humble in his approach, something that invited Ariadne to see him, not just as a champion of Athens, but as a man driven by a cause he believed in. Ariadne had always been keenly aware of the world around her, the whispers, the subtle shifts in power, the quiet movements of people who sought change, whether for good or ill. As she stood before him, she saw in Theseus the same quiet determination that had once burned in her own heart when she had first questioned the labyrinth, the tribute, and the gods. It was a moment of recognition, a silent understanding that their fates might be entwined in ways neither could yet fully comprehend. "Are you the one who has come to put an end to the Minotaur?" she asked, her voice steady but soft, as though speaking to a dream. Theseus, gazing at her with the same intensity that had carried him across the seas, nodded. "I am." In that simple exchange, Ariadne felt a shift within herself. She had never been one to shy away from difficult truths, but she also knew what was at stake. The labyrinth, the beast within, and the tribute. They were all things that bound her people in ways she could not escape. And yet, standing before this hero, she felt the stirrings of something more. Theseus was not just here to defeat the Minotaur. He was here to break the cycle that had held the island of Crete in its grip for so long. His victory would not just be a triumph for Athens, but a hope for all those who had been bound by the cruel demands of the gods. Ariadne's heart quickened. She had always known that the labyrinth held secrets, but now, standing in its shadow, she began to understand that her role in this tale was far greater than she had ever imagined. The labyrinth, though a prison, could also be a place of liberation, not just for Theseus, but for herself. The choice before her was not an easy one. To help the hero meant defying her father, her family, and everything she had ever known. But to stay silent, to watch the sacrifice of innocent lives continue, was a burden she could no longer bear. "I can help you," Ariadne said, her voice more resolute than she had anticipated. "I can guide you through the labyrinth." Theseus's eyes softened, his expression turning from the intense focus of a warrior on a mission to that of a man who had just received an unexpected offer of help. "How?" Ariadne hesitated for only a moment, the weight of her decision pressing against her chest. "I will give you a thread," she said, her fingers curling instinctively. "You will tie it at the entrance of the labyrinth, and as you move through its paths, you will unravel it behind you. When you find the Minotaur, you will be able to retrace your steps to find your way back out." Theseus, understanding the gravity of her offer, gave her a respectful nod. "Your help is invaluable." And in that moment, Ariadne made her choice. She would guide Theseus through the labyrinth, using the thread as her gift, her offering. It was a gift not just for him, but for herself, a way to escape the quiet torment of watching lives be sacrificed in the name of a cruel tradition. It was a moment that would alter the course of her life and the life of Crete forever. As Theseus prepared for his journey into the heart of the labyrinth, Ariadne's heart beat with a quiet anticipation. The future was uncertain, and the risks were immense. But for the first time, Ariadne felt as though she might be able to carve a path through the darkness. The thread she would give him would not only guide Theseus, but would also lead her out of the maze that had long confined her own heart. As the days passed, Ariadne's thoughts became ever more consumed by the hero she had just met. Theseus, with his quiet determination and the fire in his eyes, had stirred something deep within her, a part of her that had been buried beneath the weight of royal duty and the darkness of her family's legacy. To help him was to take a step away from her own past, away from the labyrinth of lies and sacrifices that had bound her family. But it was also a step towards something unknown, something dangerous, and perhaps something freeing. Ariadne's plan was simple, yet fraught with peril. She would help Theseus navigate the labyrinth, providing him with the thread that could lead him safely through the maze's twisting passages. She would give him the means to find the Minotaur, to confront the beast, and, if the gods were willing, to destroy it. But the risk she took was not only in aiding a foreign hero against her own father's will. The labyrinth was no ordinary maze. It was a place where the boundaries between life and death were blurred, where the gods themselves seemed to weave the fates of those who entered. To help Theseus was to defy the very structure of power that kept Crete in its grasp. For Ariadne, the decision had not been made lightly. She had watched for years as the tribute was paid, as innocent young Athenians were led to the labyrinth's entrance, only to vanish into its dark corridors, never to be seen again. She had felt the guilt of her family's participation in the sacrificial rites, but she had never before had the courage to act. Now, standing at the edge of this new possibility, she felt an urgency that was both thrilling and terrifying. The thought of Theseus defeating the Minotaur, breaking the cycle of bloodshed, filled her with a sense of hope she had long since forgotten. Her plan began with the thread, a symbol of both escape and connection. Ariadne had already envisioned it in her mind. The slender, delicate string she would give Theseus, made of fine silk, spun with care and intention. She would present it to him before he entered the labyrinth, a gift wrapped in silence, but carrying with it the weight of her own rebellion. The thread was a tool, a lifeline, but it was also a gesture of trust. By offering it, she would place her faith not only in Theseus's ability to defeat the Minotaur, but in the possibility that her own life could change, that she could be more than the daughter of a king, more than a silent witness to the suffering of others. As she prepared to meet Theseus once more, Ariadne felt a mix of emotions swirl inside her. Fear, excitement, a sense of profound inevitability. She would stand at the edge of the labyrinth's entrance, watching Theseus descend into its depths, and she would not know whether he would return. But in that moment, Ariadne understood that there were no guarantees in life, no certainty that even the bravest hero would survive the trials that awaited him. Yet the very act of offering him the thread felt like an act of liberation, both for him and for her. It was a step towards something different, something that could not be undone. The labyrinth itself, a place of endless corridors and secret turns, was not simply a physical challenge. It was a test of the spirit. Those who entered it were not just up against walls and doors. They were up against the very forces that controlled their fates. The gods had built the labyrinth, and the gods had set the Minotaur within it, a creature born from divine anger. The maze was a prison, not just for the beast, but for everyone who dared to face it. To survive its twists and turns was to defy the gods themselves, to challenge the forces that sought to control the lives of mortals. Ariadne understood the enormity of what she was doing. She was not simply offering help to a hero. She was offering him a way to rewrite the story, to break the cycle of sacrifice that had defined her life. If Theseus succeeded, the tribute would end, and the Minotaur's reign of terror would be over. The gods might not be pleased with her actions, but for once she felt a sense of agency, a feeling that she could choose her own path, rather than be dictated to by the whims of fate. When the moment finally arrived, Ariadne met Theseus in the garden once more, beneath the shade of the olive trees. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air was thick with the scent of flowers. Theseus stood before her, ready for the trials that lay ahead. He was calm, but there was a tension in his posture, a readiness that spoke of the battle to come. Without a word, Ariadne handed him the thread. It was delicate, almost weightless in her hands, but in its simplicity it carried the weight of her decision. Theseus took it with a quiet nod, understanding the significance of the gift she offered. "You must be careful," Ariadne said softly, her voice steady despite the tumult inside her. "The labyrinth is not just a place of walls. It is a place of the gods, and the gods will not let you pass easily." Theseus looked at her, his eyes steady. "I will not fail," he said, his voice low and determined. Ariadne nodded, though her heart tightened with uncertainty. She had given him the means to find his way, but whether he would return was another matter entirely. The labyrinth was an unknown, a place of darkness and death. She could only hope that the thread she had given him would guide him back, just as she hoped it would guide her own heart towards something more. As Theseus turned to walk toward the entrance of the labyrinth, Ariadne watched him go, her heart a mixture of hope and fear. The thread she had given him would not just be his lifeline, it would be her own. It would be the thread that connected her to the future, to the possibility of a life free from the legacy of the Minotaur, and the hope that something better could come from the darkness that had surrounded her. And as Theseus stepped into the labyrinth, Ariadne knew that her life too had entered a new and uncertain path. Whether he succeeded or failed, her future would never be the same. The air inside the labyrinth was thick with a palpable stillness, as though the very walls held their breath, waiting for what was to come. Theseus, now deep within the maze, moved cautiously, the fine thread Ariadne had given him unraveling slowly from his hand, a lifeline to the world beyond. The walls of the labyrinth towered around him, casting long shadows in the dim light that filtered through narrow slits, and every corner seemed to hold a secret, every turn a possibility of danger. He had come with courage and determination, his heart beating steadily as he followed the thread that would guide him through the twists and turns. The Minotaur was out there, lurking somewhere in the dark, its heavy footsteps echoing through the corridors like a thunderclap. The beast, half man and half bull, was not just a creature of flesh and bone. It was a living symbol of the curse that had befallen Crete, a beast born of divine wrath and human folly. Theseus moved with purpose, his senses sharpened, every instinct honed for the battle ahead. He could hear the distant sound of the Minotaur's growls reverberating off the stone, a low, guttural rumble that sent shivers through the very walls of the labyrinth. The creature was near, its presence undeniable, and Theseus knew that it was only a matter of time before they would meet face to face. The thread in his hand, fragile yet powerful, was more than just a guide. It was a promise that Ariadne had placed in his care. With every step he took, he was reminded of her trust in him, of the hope she had given him. Her gift was his strength, and it was a strength he would need, for what lay ahead would not be won by courage alone. It would take all of his skill, his wits, and the will to survive. As Theseus rounded a corner, he came upon a vast open space within the labyrinth, a cavernous chamber, dimly lit by the flickering shadows cast by his torch. In the center of the chamber stood the Minotaur, its hulking form outlined by the faint light. The creature's eyes glowed with an otherworldly fury, its breathing heavy and labored, a cloud of steam rising from its nostrils as it sized up its opponent. The beast was both terrifying and majestic, a creature forged from the very essence of violence and darkness. Theseus felt his pulse quicken, but he did not hesitate. He knew that this moment was inevitable. He had come here for one purpose: to end the terror that the Minotaur had brought to the world. To defeat this creature was to reclaim the lives of those who had been lost in the labyrinth, to break the cycle of death and sacrifice that had bound the city of Athens to Crete. The Minotaur lunged first, its horns gleaming in the dim light as it charged toward him with terrifying speed. Theseus narrowly dodged, feeling the heat of the beast's massive body brush against him. He could smell the foul scent of its breath, a mixture of blood and the wildness of its captivity. The creature was fierce, driven by an animal rage, but Theseus was swift, his movements practiced and precise. He had trained for this moment, though no amount of preparation could have fully prepared him for the fury of the Minotaur. As the beast circled him, Theseus kept his focus, remembering the thread that had brought him here, remembering Ariadne's trust. He did not look for glory in this fight. He sought only victory. The labyrinth had been designed to contain the Minotaur, to imprison it in its endless corridors. But Theseus knew that it was not only the creature that was imprisoned here. He too was trapped in a web of destiny in the hands of the gods. The Minotaur's next attack came swiftly, its horns aimed directly at Theseus's chest. But Theseus was ready. He sidestepped, his sword flashing as he thrust it forward with all his strength. The blade struck true, cutting through the beast's flesh. The Minotaur howled in pain, its blood pouring from the wound as it staggered back. For a moment, there was silence, save for the creature's laboured breathing and the sound of Theseus's own heartbeat. He had wounded the beast, but it was far from defeated. The Minotaur bellowed in rage, its fury mounting as it charged again, more desperate than before. This time, it was not the brute force of the creature that Theseus had to fear, but its cunning. The beast was not mindless. It was a creature of instinct, but also one of intelligence, a reflection of the god's wrath and the cruelty of its existence. Theseus waited, holding his ground. He knew that the battle was not just one of strength, but of strategy. He had to outmaneuver the Minotaur, to use the labyrinth itself against it. As the creature charged once more, Theseus ducked, letting the beast pass just inches above him. In the same fluid motion, he spun and drove his sword into the Minotaur's side, striking deep into its heart. The creature let out a final guttural roar, its body shuddering as the life drained from it. Theseus stepped back, watching as the Minotaur crumpled to the floor, its massive frame falling with a heavy thud. It was over. The beast was slain, its reign of terror finally brought to an end. But even in victory, there was no joy in Theseus's heart. The battle had been fought not only in the labyrinth, but in the very soul of Crete. A battle that had been won not by the strength of one man, but by the courage of many. Theseus knew that he had done more than kill a monster. He had broken the chains that had held the island captive for so long. As he stood over the fallen creature, Theseus felt the weight of Ariadne's thread in his hand. The thread that had guided him, that had been the beacon of hope in this dark place, was now the symbol of his triumph. It was a simple thing, yet it had changed everything. The labyrinth had been a prison for both the Minotaur and the people of Crete. Now, with the beast slain, it was no longer a place of fear. Theseus had come for the Minotaur, but he had also come for Ariadne's people, for a future where the cycle of sacrifice could be broken, where the darkness of the labyrinth could give way to light. As he retraced his steps, following the thread back through the maze, Theseus felt a quiet sense of resolve. He had accomplished what he had set out to do. But the journey was not yet over, and the story of Ariadne, of Crete, and of their intertwined fates was far from complete. The labyrinth, once a place of terror and entrapment, now seemed a different realm altogether. Its winding corridors, which had once whispered of death, now felt strangely empty. The echoes of the Minotaur's growls had faded, leaving only silence. It was the silence of a place that had been freed from its curse, and in this stillness Theseus walked, his mind focused, his steps steady. The thread, now nearly unwound, was the only guide that kept him on track as he retraced his path, back through the maze's endless twists and turns. The labyrinth that had once seemed impenetrable was now a place of simple passage, as though the very structure of it had been undone by the creature's fall. Theseus's heart still raced with the weight of the battle, but the burden of fear had lifted. The Minotaur was gone, and with it the ancient terror that had plagued both the people of Athens and Crete. The way back, though clearer than before, was still a challenge. The labyrinth had been designed to confuse, to disorient even the sharpest minds. Yet, with Ariadne's thread in his hand, Theseus knew that he would not falter. Each step he took was a reminder of the trust she had placed in him, a trust that had brought him this far, and a trust that would carry him all the way to the surface, back to the world beyond the maze. As he emerged from the labyrinth's depths, the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, casting a golden light over the island of Crete. The air was crisp, the sky a clear, unbroken blue. Theseus breathed deeply, the scent of the sea and the earth filling his lungs. He had entered the labyrinth as a stranger, a hero on a mission. But now, as he stood at its threshold, he felt as though he had been transformed. The Minotaur's death had not only freed the people of Athens from their torment, but had also given Theseus a new sense of purpose, a sense of belonging that he had not known before. He looked down at the thread in his hand, its delicate silk now frayed from its journey through the labyrinth. It had guided him, not just through the maze, but through his own doubts, his own fears. He had faced the Minotaur, and in doing so had faced a part of himself, a part of him that was capable of great courage, of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. The victory over the beast had not been won with sheer strength alone, but with a quiet resolve, a belief in the possibility of change. The palace of Knossos lay ahead, its walls towering above him. The journey back to Ariadne would be the final step in his mission, and yet something about the journey felt incomplete. He had defeated the Minotaur, yes, but the labyrinth still held a deeper meaning. It was not just a place of death, it was also a place of connection. The thread Ariadne had given him had bridged the gap between their two worlds, linking him not just to the maze, but to her. She had trusted him, and now he would return to her, bringing with him the proof of their shared victory. As Theseus made his way through the grand halls of the palace, he could not help but reflect on the path that had led him here. He had set out with the intent to slay the beast, to end the tribute, and to bring peace to his people. But in doing so, he had become part of something greater, part of a story that stretched beyond the boundaries of the labyrinth, beyond the walls of Crete. His fate was now bound to Ariadne's, for it was her faith in him that had made this victory possible. The palace was eerily quiet as he made his way toward the courtyard. The people of Crete had yet to hear of the Minotaur's death, and the air was thick with anticipation. Theseus's heart beat faster, but not out of fear. It was a nervous excitement, the kind that came with the knowledge that the hardest part of the journey had passed. Soon he would see Ariadne again, the woman who had given him the thread, the woman who had given him hope. As he stepped into the courtyard, his eyes searched the faces of the gathered people. But it was Ariadne who stood out, her figure as striking as ever. She was waiting for him, standing tall and graceful, her eyes fixed on him as he approached. There was no need for words at first. The look in her eyes spoke volumes, a mixture of relief, hope, and something deeper, something that neither of them could yet fully understand. Theseus reached her and, without a word, extended his hand. In his palm was the last of the thread, the final strand of the lifeline she had given him. Ariadne took it, her fingers brushing against his, and in that moment the world seemed to stand still. She had helped him, and now they stood together, united not only by the thread, but by the journey they had both undertaken. "Thank you," Theseus said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "Without you, I would not have found my way." Ariadne nodded, a smile forming at the corners of her lips. "You did the hard part," she said softly. "You were the one who faced the Minotaur, but I'm glad it was you." In the quiet of the courtyard, with the sun rising behind them, the two of them stood together, no longer simply the daughter of a king and a foreign hero. They were something new, something born of the labyrinth and of the hope that had led them through its darkness. But even as they stood there, in that brief moment of peace, both knew that their journey was far from over. The labyrinth had been defeated, but its legacy lingered in the hearts of those who had been touched by its shadow. The story of Ariadne and Theseus was not just the story of one victory, but of the lives they would continue to lead, bound together by the trials they had faced and the trust they had shared. The days following the Minotaur's death passed in a blur of celebration and quiet reflection. The people of Crete rejoiced, for the tribute that had haunted their island for generations was finally at an end. King Minos, though proud of his daughter's bravery, could not ignore the quiet undercurrent of unease that seemed to hang in the air. The gods had watched over the labyrinth, and now they seemed to turn their gaze elsewhere. It was as though the island itself held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. But for Ariadne, the victory felt incomplete. The labyrinth was behind them, its curse broken, and yet something deeper lingered in the spaces between her thoughts. Her connection to Theseus had grown in a way she had not expected, not just through the thread that had guided him, but through the shared understanding of what they had accomplished together. They were no longer strangers or enemies, but two souls whose fates had intertwined in the dark corridors of the labyrinth. And yet, even as they stood side by side, the world outside the labyrinth called to him. Theseus was not of Crete, and his mission had never been about staying. He had come to slay the Minotaur, to break the tribute that bound Athens to Crete, and now, with his victory, his city needed him. The promises made, the lives changed, would have to be honored in a different way, far from the shores of the island where he had found both triumph and sorrow. The morning of his departure arrived with the soft light of dawn creeping over the horizon, painting the sea in hues of orange and gold. Theseus stood at the edge of the palace courtyard, preparing to board his ship. His eyes were distant, but there was a calmness about him, a quiet certainty that had not been there when he had first arrived. His victory had been hard-earned, but it had also given him a new sense of self, a sense of purpose that extended beyond the walls of the labyrinth. Ariadne watched him from a distance, her heart heavy, her thoughts a swirl of conflicting emotions. She had helped him, had given him the thread that had saved him, And yet, now she found herself standing on the edge of something else. A parting that would not be easy, no matter how inevitable it seemed. Theseus had kept his word. He had slain the Minotaur, ended the tribute, and freed the people of Athens from their suffering. But now he was leaving, returning to the life he had left behind, the city that had called him home. Ariadne had known, on some level, that this moment would come. The labyrinth had been their shared story, but it was not the beginning or the end of either of their lives. There was no permanence in the shifting tides of fate. As she approached him, the sound of her footsteps seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the morning air. When Theseus turned to face her, the look in his eyes was soft, yet filled with an undeniable sadness. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet understanding between them. "I will never forget what you did for me," Theseus said, his voice low but steady. "Without you, I would not have made it through the labyrinth. You gave me more than just a way out. You gave me hope." Ariadne felt a lump form in her throat at his words. The tension that had built between them over the days had now turned to something gentler, something that felt like a farewell. She had given him the thread, the symbol of her trust, of her belief that he could change the course of their fate. But now, as she stood before him, she understood that their story was not meant to be a forever. It was a chapter in a much larger tale. "I did not do it for glory," Ariadne replied, her voice quieter than she had meant. "I did it because I could not watch any more lives be lost, and because I believed in you. But now it is time for you to return to your own people." Theseus nodded, understanding the unspoken truth between them. He had not come to Crete to remain. His duty lay with Athens. Yet the bond they had forged, however brief, was something that neither of them could easily forget. "Ariadne," Theseus said, his voice thick with emotion, I wish things were different, but I must go. My people need me." She nodded, forcing herself to smile, though it felt like a hollow gesture. She had known this would happen, had known it from the moment he had set foot on the island. But knowing something intellectually was very different from feeling it in your heart. Ariadne felt as though she were letting go of something precious, something that could never truly be replaced. "Then go," she said softly, though her heart ached with the words. "Your people are waiting, and you have already done more than I could have ever asked for." There was a moment of stillness between them, an unspoken understanding that hung in the air, thick with the weight of what they had shared. Ariadne knew she would never forget Theseus, the hero who had entered her life like a comet, burning bright and fast, only to leave with the same speed. But she also knew that their paths were not meant to cross again. She would remain in Crete, in the palace that was both her home and her prison, and he would return to Athens, to a city that awaited his return with open arms. With a final, lingering glance, Theseus turned and walked toward his ship. The sound of his footsteps faded, and Ariadne watched as he boarded the vessel, preparing to set sail. The ship's sails unfurled, catching the wind as it began to pull away from the shore, the distance between them growing with every passing moment. Ariadne stood motionless, her heart a heavy weight in her chest, watching him disappear into the horizon. The sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the sea as the ship grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing but a speck in the distance. Ariadne took a deep breath, the wind tugging at her hair, and finally turned away. She knew that her life too must continue. But the memory of Theseus, of the labyrinth, and of the journey they had shared would remain with her forever. The departure of Theseus left a silence that seemed to hang over Crete like a thick fog. The island, once alive with the heavy rituals of sacrifice and the tense anticipation of the Minotaur's demands, now felt strangely empty. The people celebrated the victory, of course, their lives no longer threatened by the terror that had gripped them for so long. But in the midst of their joy, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, a sense that the change they had hoped for had come at a price they were only beginning to understand. Ariadne, though, felt the absence of Theseus more acutely than any of them. She had known that his departure was inevitable. After all, his mission had always been one of duty to Athens, and he had not come to Crete with the intention of staying. But that knowledge had not softened the blow of watching him leave. The bond they had shared, however brief, had been something deeper than either of them had anticipated. It was a connection forged in the darkness of the labyrinth, in the quiet trust of one person helping another to find their way out. Now, with Theseus gone, Ariadne found herself adrift once more, her world reduced to the walls of the palace and the weight of her family's legacy. She had helped to defeat the Minotaur, to end the tribute, but at what cost? Her father, King Minos, though proud of his daughter's courage, was still the ruler of Crete, and his grip on the island remained strong. The victory over the Minotaur had not freed Ariadne from the constraints of her royal birth, nor had it removed her from the tangled politics that defined her life. In the weeks that followed, Ariadne tried to find solace in the quiet spaces of the palace, in the gardens where she had once met Theseus, but it was difficult. The labyrinth had been a place of both terror and hope, and now, without the Minotaur to focus on, the emptiness of her own life seemed more pronounced. The echoes of the past rang louder than ever, and though she had helped to bring about change, she still found herself trapped within the very world she had hoped to escape. Her thoughts often turned to Theseus, to the quiet moments they had shared, to the thread that had guided him through the maze. She wondered if he too felt the absence of their connection, if he thought back on his time in Crete as she did. But she knew the answer, even before she asked the question. Theseus had his city, his people, and his own future to focus on. For him, the labyrinth and its challenges had been a chapter in his story, a part of his journey. But for Ariadne, it had been more. It had been a glimpse of a different life, a life that felt like it might have been possible, if only for a fleeting moment. King Minos, ever the shrewd ruler, took little time in assessing the changes that had come to Crete. The people had cheered for the death of the Minotaur, but they also whispered in the corners of the palace about the consequences of ending the tribute. What would become of Crete now? Without the ritual that had bound their city to the gods, the island's fate seemed uncertain. Minos had long relied on the tribute as a way to maintain his power and influence over both Crete and Athens. But now, with the Minotaur dead and the tribute ended, he was faced with a new challenge: how to restore the balance, how to keep the gods' favor and his people's loyalty without the rituals that had defined his reign. Ariadne, caught between her father's expectations and her own desire for freedom, found herself increasingly isolated. Her role in the downfall of the Minotaur had brought her little in the way of personal gain. She was still a princess, still bound to the island by the ties of her blood and the expectations of her family. Her father's pride in her was tempered by his unspoken concern over the political ramifications of Theseus's victory. Though the tribute had ended, the balance of power between Crete and Athens had shifted, and Minos was not one to leave things to chance. Days stretched into weeks, and Ariadne continued to move through her life in a haze, her mind often wandering to thoughts of Theseus, wondering what he was doing, if he was thinking of her. The palace was still a grand place to live, filled with riches and beauty, but it had become a gilded cage, one she could not escape. Her father was as distant as ever, consumed by his concerns over the shifting tides of power, and Ariadne could not help but feel a growing sense of suffocation. The labyrinth was no longer just a maze of stone. It had become a maze of her own making, a prison of expectation and duty. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the island in a soft golden light, Ariadne walked alone along the edge of the palace gardens. The scent of the evening flowers filled the air, but it could not calm the restlessness that had taken root in her heart. She longed for something more than this, more than the life that had been set before her by birth, more than the hollow praise of her father. She had given so much, and yet she felt as though she had nothing in return. In the distance, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to echo her thoughts, a constant reminder of the world beyond the palace, beyond the walls that confined her. Somewhere out there was a future she could not yet see, a life that was not defined by her royal lineage, her duty to her father, or the legacy of the Minotaur. But for now, that future was as distant as Theseus's ship had been when it sailed away from Crete. The journey back to Athens was one of triumph, yet it was also marked by a deep sense of change. Theseus had returned victorious, the slayer of the Minotaur, the hero who had fulfilled his promise to end the tribute and free the city from its dark burden. The people of Athens welcomed him with open arms, their joy echoing through the streets. It was a homecoming that should have been pure celebration, but for Theseus there was something hollow about it. The weight of victory was not as sweet as he had imagined. Though the crowds cheered, Theseus's thoughts often wandered back to Crete, to the labyrinth, and most of all, to Ariadne. He had promised her his return, but circumstances had made that promise impossible to keep. He had left her behind, knowing the gravity of what he had done, yet unable to remain. The political realities of Athens and the obligations to his people could not be ignored. As he sailed across the Aegean, the island of Crete had faded into the distance, but the memory of Ariadne lingered in his heart. He could not forget the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she had trusted him, offering him the thread that had guided him through the labyrinth. She had played a crucial role in his victory, yet, upon his return, there was no space for such thoughts. The people of Athens were eager to bask in the glory of their hero, to place him upon a pedestal as one who had conquered the Ougoi, greatest of beasts. But these fleeting honors could not fill the emptiness he felt within himself. As the ship neared the shores of Athens, Theseus stood at the bow, gazing out at the city that was now his to lead. His mother, Aethra, awaited his return with open arms, and the sense of duty he had long carried as the son of a king surged within him. Yet, even as he prepared to step onto the familiar soil of his homeland, there was an unsettled feeling in his chest, The labyrinth had changed him, not only by the physical act of defeating the Minotaur, but by the internal journey he had undergone. He had faced death in the maze, not just in the form of the beast, but in the form of his own fears, doubts, and desires. He had faced the darkness of Crete, and it was only now that he understood how much of that darkness had seeped into his own heart. Though the Minotaur was slain, it was not just the beast that he had confronted in the labyrinth. It was something deeper, something he could not yet articulate. The labyrinth had been a reflection of his own inner maze, the twists and turns of his identity, his ambition, and his sense of purpose. He had come to Crete as a hero, but in many ways he was leaving as a man who had been shaped and reshaped by the choices he had made. The moment Theseus set foot on the shores of Athens, the reality of his situation became clear. The city was in need of leadership, in need of direction after the loss of so many lives to the Minotaur. The people looked to Theseus as their savior, their protector, and their king. But he could not shake the feeling that, despite all of their gratitude, the truth of who he had become during his time in Crete would remain forever hidden. He had left a piece of himself behind on the island, a piece that had been irrevocably altered by the encounter with Ariadne, by the labyrinth, and by the gods themselves. The ceremony upon his return was lavish. The city's greatest warriors, statesmen, and priests gathered to witness his arrival, and the streets were lined with banners and wreaths. Theseus was celebrated not only for his bravery, but for the end of the cycle of death that had gripped Athens for so long. No longer would young men and women be sent to Crete as tributes. The curse was lifted, and Theseus had broken it. Yet, amid the noise and the crowds, he found little joy. His thoughts drifted back to Ariadne, wondering what had become of her after his departure. Had she truly understood why he had to leave? As Theseus made his way through the city, his eyes searched the crowd, but no one stood out to him like Ariadne had. His thoughts swirled, caught between the demands of his people and the memory of the woman he had left behind. She had given him the thread, not only to guide him through the labyrinth, but as a symbol of something greater, a trust, a bond that had connected them even in the darkest of times. He had failed to honor that bond. Despite the praise heaped upon him, Theseus could not escape the nagging sense that his return to Athens was not a true homecoming. He had come back to lead, to serve his people, but he had also come back to a life that felt smaller than it had before. The labyrinth had changed his perception of himself, of what it meant to be a hero, and of what it meant to be connected to another person. The victory over the Minotaur, while momentous, had only led him to realize that the path to true peace was not found in glory or adulation, but in understanding the choices that had shaped his life. As Theseus walked into the heart of Athens, the cheers of the people seemed distant, as though the walls of the city had grown too high for him to truly feel a part of it. He had come from Crete with the story of victory, but now, as the crowds parted and the city embraced him, Theseus realized that the true journey had only just begun. The labyrinth had taught him one thing above all else, that the road ahead would not always be clear, and that the journey of a hero was not always as simple as defeating monsters or breaking curses. It was about the choices he made and the lives he touched along the way. The days following Theseus's return were filled with the weight of responsibility. Though Athens had celebrated his victory, it soon became clear that the triumph over the Minotaur had not freed him from the burdens of leadership. His father, Aegeus, had always spoken of the duties of a king, of the sacrifices required to maintain power. But it was only now that Theseus understood the depth of those words. Victory, it seemed, brought with it a new kind of struggle. The people of Athens looked to him for guidance, for protection, and for the restoration of peace. Yet Theseus could not escape the quiet ache within him. He had returned home, but the sense of homecoming he had once imagined was not what he had expected. The cheers and the celebrations had been fleeting, overshadowed by the complexities of leadership. Even as he walked through the city's grand streets, his heart felt heavy, weighed down not by the adoration of his people, but by the knowledge that the price of heroism was far steeper than he had ever anticipated. Theseus often found himself alone in the palace, standing before the sea, gazing out at the horizon where the sun kissed the water's edge. It was a reminder of the world beyond Athens, the world that had shaped him, a world where the labyrinth, the Minotaur, and Ariadne had once been his reality. Now, as the weight of the crown pressed heavily upon him, Theseus could not shake the sense that something was missing. His victory over the Minotaur had been more than just an act of heroism. It had been a journey of self-discovery, a confrontation with his own fears and uncertainties. Yet, now that he was back in Athens, it felt as though he had lost a part of himself, a part that had been shaped by the maze, by the labyrinth, and by the woman who had trusted him to escape. The memory of Ariadne lingered in his mind, as vivid as the day he had left her on the shores of Crete. He had promised her his return, yet the responsibilities of Athens had consumed him. In the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts, Theseus wondered what had become of her. Had she found peace? Was she still waiting for him, even now? He knew the answer, deep down, that she had not waited, that she could not. She was a princess, a woman bound to her own fate, and her path had diverged from his long ago. But the bond they had shared, however brief, had left an indelible mark on his heart. Ariadne had been the one to guide him through the labyrinth, the one who had given him the thread that had saved his life. She had believed in him when no one else did, and in doing so, had shown him a path not just through the maze, but through the darkest parts of himself. And yet, as Theseus stood on the edge of the world, watching the waves crash against the cliffs, he realized that there was no way to return to her. No amount of longing or regret could change the choices that had been made. Theseus had returned to Athens, and his duty to his people could not be ignored. The people of Athens, though grateful, did not understand the inner turmoil that gnawed at Theseus. They saw only the hero, the man who had ended their suffering, but they did not see the weight of the crown, the burden of leadership that he had inherited. He could not speak of his struggles with them. He could not share the emptiness that had settled in his heart. No one could truly understand what it was like to bear the title of hero, to live in the shadow of your own myth. It was a title that came with praise and adoration, but also with a deep, unspoken loneliness. The throne of Athens was his now, and with it came decisions that would shape the future of the city. The people looked to him for justice, for strength, and for wisdom. Theseus had once believed that his destiny was to conquer monsters and face impossible odds. But now he understood that the true test of a hero was not in slaying beasts or conquering lands, but in the quiet, everyday decisions that affected the lives of those around him. It was not enough to defeat the Minotaur. He had to build a future for Athens, a future that would carry the weight of his actions for generations to come. In the days that followed, Theseus threw himself into his duties as king. He reformed the city's laws, strengthened its defenses, and worked tirelessly to ensure that Athens would never again fall victim to the whims of fate. But no matter how much he accomplished, no matter how many victories he won, there was still an emptiness within him that could not be filled. The labyrinth had shown him who he could be, who he was capable of becoming. But now, as he ruled Athens, Theseus realized that the greatest challenge he faced was not one of strength or courage, but of understanding the cost of heroism, the price of victory. The people of Athens saw him as a symbol of hope, a beacon of light in a world that had once been darkened by fear. They did not see the man behind the myth, the man who had fought not just for his people, but for his own sense of identity. In their eyes, Theseus was the hero who had defeated the Minotaur, the savior of Athens. But in his own heart, Theseus could not escape the feeling that he was still lost, still wandering through the maze of his own life, seeking something he could not define. Though Theseus had returned to Athens a hero, the city's bustling streets, grand temples, and thriving markets could not shake the feeling of an unfinished journey that lingered within him. He had defeated the Minotaur, ended the tribute, and brought peace to his people. Yet, with every step he took through the city, he was reminded that there were no true endings. Not for a hero, not for him. The days passed, and Theseus found himself consumed by the mechanics of leadership. He held court, consulted with his advisors, and made decisions that would affect generations to come. Athens, under his rule, began to flourish. The people were safe, the threat of the labyrinth and its horrors now a distant memory. The city looked to him for strength and guidance, as they had always looked to their kings. But with every decree he issued, Theseus couldn't escape the quiet pull of longing that tugged at his heart. The labyrinth, once a symbol of terror and defeat, had become something else, something personal. In the labyrinth, Theseus had confronted not just the Minotaur, but his own fears. In the twists and turns of its dark corridors, he had discovered courage he hadn't known he possessed. He had confronted the beast and survived. But now, in the bright, sunlit streets of Athens, Theseus found himself facing something far more difficult to conquer: the truth of who he had become and what he had left behind. The gods, who had watched over his journey, had granted him victory. But victory, Theseus had come to learn, was a fleeting thing. There was no triumph that lasted forever. Even the greatest of heroes, the most celebrated of kings, eventually faded from the world's memory. The stories of their deeds, told and retold, became myth, and with myth came distance. Time, Theseus realized, would eventually wear down the sharp edges of his heroism, smoothing them into something more palatable, more manageable for the ages. But for him, the weight of it all, the weight of the Minotaur, the labyrinth, the promises he had made, still pressed upon him. There was, of course, the matter of Ariadne. His mind often drifted back to her, to the woman whose faith in him had changed the course of his fate. She had given him the thread, and through it she had offered him not just a way out of the labyrinth, but a way into himself. he had seen something in her eyes, something that had connected them beyond the walls of Crete. It was a bond that had never been broken, even after their parting. Yet, despite this bond, Theseus could not help but wonder if Ariadne's life had moved on. She had given him everything she could, yet he had left her behind, swept away by his duty to Athens. Theseus understood the reasons for his departure, yet the absence of Ariadne in his life left a hole that could not be filled by the adoration of his people or the glory of his victories. He had returned to Athens, but the pieces of his heart remained scattered across the sea on the shores of Crete where Ariadne waited. Or perhaps she had stopped waiting long ago. Still, Theseus could not bring himself to abandon his responsibilities, not now when Athens was finally at peace. He had made promises to his people, promises to his father, and promises to himself. He had risen to the challenge of being a king, and now he must rise to the challenge of being a ruler who could sustain that peace. He could not afford the luxury of regret, of longing for something that was no longer within his reach. As the weeks turned into months, Theseus buried himself in the work of governance. There was always something to be done, a dispute to settle, a new law to establish, a new threat to neutralize. His people needed him, and he needed them. In the bustling city of Athens, with its vibrant life and endless opportunities, Theseus could not afford to dwell on the past. He had given his word to his people that their lives would be better, that they would never again fall victim to the horrors of Crete, and for that promise he had to move forward. Yet, no matter how much Theseus threw himself into the work of the city, he could not erase the nagging feeling that there was something unfinished, something he had left behind that would haunt him forever. The labyrinth had been a physical place, but it had also been a mirror of his soul, a reflection of his deepest fears, his insecurities, and his desires. Now, free from the walls of the maze, Theseus found himself still trapped within the walls of his own heart. He had defeated the Minotaur, yes. He had freed Athens, restored peace, and become a hero. But in the quiet moments of the night, when the city's noise faded and the stars twinkled above, Theseus was left with the question that no hero could ever fully answer. Was he truly free? The journey through the labyrinth had been his test. But now it was clear that the real journey, the one that truly mattered, was the journey of understanding himself, of reconciling the man he had become with the man he had once imagined himself to be. It was a journey that would take him far beyond the walls of Athens, far beyond the reach of any myth, and yet it was one he would have to face alone. Far across the sea, on the distant shores of Naxos, Ariadne began her life anew. The island, with its gentle waves and quiet hills, stood in stark contrast to the bustling courts of Crete, where her journey had begun. It was here, far from the labyrinth and the shadow of the Minotaur, that Ariadne was finally free to shape her own destiny. Yet, freedom, like the threads she had once offered Theseus, was not as simple as it seemed. In the stillness of Naxos, Ariadne reflected on the choices that had brought her here. She had given all of herself to Theseus. Her love had been boundless, and the hope of a life together had seemed so clear, so certain. But fate, it seemed, had its own designs. She had watched him sail away from her, a fleeting figure on the horizon, as she stood alone beneath the darkening sky. The promise of love had crumbled in her hands, like sand slipping through fingers, and with it, a part of her had shattered. But time, as it always does, healed those wounds. Slowly, gently, as the days stretched into months and then years, the sharp edge of her loss began to dull. Ariadne found solace in the rhythms of the island. She became acquainted with the quiet moments, the sound of the waves lapping against the shore, the calls of distant birds in the early morning, the rustle of the wind through the olive trees. These small comforts anchored her, bringing a peace she had not known when she had lived in the shadow of the labyrinth. It was here, on Naxos, that Dionysus found her. He had been watching her from afar, drawn to her beauty and strength, and perhaps to the sadness that still lingered within her heart. Ariadne, though initially wary of this god who had appeared so suddenly in her life, soon recognized in him something she had not expected: understanding. Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, was no stranger to pain. He had known loss, betrayal, and the fragility of existence in a way that few others could comprehend. Dionysus did not seek to replace the love Ariadne had once felt for Theseus. Instead, he offered her something different, a chance for rebirth. He saw in her not the woman abandoned, but the woman who had endured, who had given everything, and yet still stood strong, still reached for something greater. In his eyes, Ariadne was more than a princess cast aside. She was a queen in her own right, a woman capable of shaping her own future, of weaving her own fate, free from the entanglements of the past. Ariadne's heart, once heavy with sorrow, began to soften in the presence of Dionysus. His laughter, his warmth, and his carefree nature were like sunlight breaking through the clouds. He spoke to her of joy, of freedom, and of the mysteries of the world. He invited her into his world, where the bonds of mortals could be loosened and the soul could dance freely, unburdened by the past. It was a world of music and celebration, where every moment felt like an embrace. Dionysus and Ariadne's love blossomed slowly, like a flower opening to the first light of dawn. There were no promises or grand gestures, only a shared understanding that life, though fleeting, could still be beautiful. It was a love without the weight of expectations, a love that allowed both to grow and change, to find new purposes without being defined by their pasts. The gods, watching from their lofty heights, smiled upon their union. It was said that, in time, Ariadne became not just Dionysus's consort, but his equal, ruling beside him in the realm of wine, revelry, and liberation. Her once dull sadness faded, replaced by a joy that was both fierce and unshakable. The island of Naxos, once a place of solitude and mourning, became a sacred space where the goddess of the vine and the god of ecstasy came together in harmony. But Ariadne's story did not end with her love for Dionysus. Though her life had taken a new turn, the memory of her past, of her life with Theseus, of the labyrinth and of the sacrifice she had made, remained a quiet undercurrent, a reminder of the strength that had shaped her. She had once been the one to offer the thread, to guide Theseus through the maze and out of the darkness. Now, she was the one who had woven her own way out of the shadows, not through the guidance of another, but through the wisdom and grace that had always been within her. In time, Ariadne would be transformed into a goddess in her own right. Some say that when she died, she was taken up to the heavens by Dionysus, where she was placed among the stars. There, in the night sky, her constellation, the crown, or corona borealis, would shine forever, a symbol of her enduring strength, her rebirth, and her eternal connection to the divine. The gods had taken her from the mortal world, but in doing so, they had elevated her. Ariadne had once been a mortal woman, cast adrift by fate, but now she was something more. Her journey from the cold corridors of the labyrinth to the warmth of Dionysus's embrace had been one of transformation. She had given the thread to Theseus, but in the end, it was she who had unravelled the labyrinth of her own heart, finding a new path, a new purpose, a new beginning. The legacy of Ariadne lived on, not only in the stars, but in the hearts of all who embraced their own journeys of transformation, of love, and of rebirth. Her story, though born of loss, became one of hope, a reminder that even the darkest moments could give way to light, and that the threads of fate, once tangled and knotted, could always be rewoven. Ariadne's story, though far from over, would take on a new shape with time. Her life on Naxos, now filled with the laughter and music of Dionysus, was not one of finality, but of continuation. The gods had offered her a different path, one that would extend beyond mortal limitations. Her rebirth, woven through the love she shared with Dionysus, echoed in the shifting tides of time, and her legacy spread far beyond the island that had become her sanctuary. In the quiet nights when the moon bathed the shores of Naxos in silver, Ariadne would often sit at the edge of the sea, her gaze turned toward the horizon. She had long since healed from the abandonment by Theseus, though that part of her past would always remain a part of her, like the calm depths of the ocean where memories swirled beneath the surface, ever present but not overwhelming. She had embraced a new life, a life of freedom, of joy, and of love. But there were moments when she felt the weight of her transformation, the knowledge that the path she had taken was not one that every mortal had the chance to follow. Dionysus, as ever, was by her side. His laughter, his wild spirit, had invited her into a world of indulgence and abandon, a world where every moment was an opportunity for joy. But even in this carefree realm, there was a deeper, more sacred understanding between them. An understanding that Ariadne's journey had been one of profound self-discovery, and that her place beside him was not merely as a companion, but as an equal. She had given him her love, and in return, he had gifted her with the freedom to be herself, unburdened by the expectations of others. The people of Naxos, too, began to understand the significance of Ariadne's presence. She was not just the consort of Dionysus, but a figure who had transcended the ordinary. The island, once a quiet haven, became a sacred place for those seeking the blessings of the gods. The stories of Ariadne's love, her sacrifice, and her eventual rise to the heavens spread far beyond the island's shores. Travelers came from distant lands, seeking the favor of the gods, and in doing so, they found themselves touched by the spirit of Ariadne, whose life had become a symbol of transformation. Ariadne's legacy was not confined to Naxos alone, however. In the great cities of Greece, her name became associated with the themes of renewal and the cyclical nature of life. Her story was one of a woman who had been cast aside and had risen again, not through vengeance or bitterness, but through love, understanding, and acceptance. It was a story that resonated deeply with the hearts of mortals, for in her tale they saw their own struggles mirrored, their own losses, their own attempts to find meaning in a world that often seemed cruel and indifferent. In time, Ariadne's name would be remembered not just for her connection to Theseus or Dionysus, but for her own journey of resilience. Her transformation from a princess of Crete to a goddess in her own right was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and her story would inspire generations to come. She was a figure of hope for those who had known hardship, a reminder that even the most difficult of trials could lead to something beautiful and lasting. Ariadne's constellation, the crown, Corona Borealis, would rise high in the night sky, a beacon of her eternal presence, and her image would be carried by poets, artists, and scholars for centuries. Her legacy would endure not only in the heavens, but in the hearts of those who looked up at the stars and saw in them a reflection of their own dreams, their own aspirations, and their own journeys toward the light. But there was another part of her legacy too, one that was woven not in the heavens, but in the lives of the mortals who had been touched by her story. The women of Greece, in particular, found in Ariadne a model of strength and grace. She had not allowed the pain of her abandonment to define her. She had not succumbed to despair, but had instead risen to meet the world with open arms. In this, she became a symbol of empowerment, a figure who embodied the possibility of renewal even after the most crushing of losses. And so, Ariadne's story continued to unfold, not as a tale of the past, but as a living myth that shaped the present. She had been a woman caught between worlds, between the mortal and the divine, between love and loss, between the shadows of the labyrinth and the light of the stars. But in the end, she had found her place in the world, and in doing so, had created a place for others to find their own strength and beauty. Her story would be told for generations, but it would never be just a story. It would be a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of light, and that from the deepest of losses, new beginnings can arise. As the stars glimmered above Naxos, Ariadne rested in the quiet embrace of Dionysus, her journey now complete, but her legacy only just beginning. She had offered the thread to Theseus, but in the end, it was she who had woven the fabric of her own destiny, and it was a tapestry that would endure for all time. The light of her story would never fade, and her spirit would live on, forever woven into the fabric of the mythic world. The thread that Ariadne had given Theseus, so simple yet so potent, remained an emblem of the bond they had shared. It was no ordinary strand of silk, but a symbol of guidance, of connection, of the invisible threads that wove through the lives of gods and mortals alike. Theseus had carried it with him out of the labyrinth, but Ariadne's thread did not belong solely to him. It belonged to the gods, to fate, and to the eternal cycles that bound the world together. In the labyrinth, Ariadne had been the guiding force for Theseus, offering him not only a literal thread to find his way, but also the intangible gift of hope. For the hero, the labyrinth had been a place of darkness, of confusion, where every turn threatened to ensnare him forever. Yet, with the gift of Ariadne's thread, he was able to navigate the maze's twisting passages, to emerge from its depths, and to claim victory over the Minotaur. For Ariadne, it had been a gift of love, a small yet monumental act of trust in Theseus, hoping that he would fulfill his promise, that he would not forget her. But after Theseus sailed away from Crete, the thread that once connected them seemed to unravel. It was not just the physical distance that separated them, but a deeper sense of abandonment that Ariadne had come to feel. The thread she had offered, once filled with the promise of a shared future, now seemed like a fragile memory, a reminder of a love that had been left behind. And yet, Ariadne's heart, ever resilient, knew that the thread was not broken. it was only transformed. Dionysus, the god who had found her when she was most vulnerable, was the one who truly understood the significance of the thread. He, too, had known the capricious nature of fate, how quickly a life could shift from joy to sorrow, from celebration to grief. Yet Dionysus had learned that even the twists of fate could lead to something new, something unimagined. In this, he saw in Ariadne not a woman who had been abandoned, but a woman who had transcended the twists and turns of her own story, a woman who had found a new path, a new thread to follow. The thread of Ariadne's life, once bound to Theseus, now moved in a different direction. It was no longer tied to the expectations of a hero's quest, but to the flow of Dionysus's revelry, to the rhythm of joy and ecstasy. Ariadne's rebirth was not just in the love she shared with Dionysus, but in the understanding that her story was hers to tell, hers to weave. She had chosen the path that would lead her to freedom, to self-discovery, and to the stars. As the years passed, the thread that had once been given to Theseus would become a symbol of something more. In time, it would be said that Ariadne's story was not simply one of loss and recovery, but of creation, the creation of a new self, a new destiny. It was a story that resonated not only with those who had known abandonment, but with all those who had felt the weight of the world pressing down upon them. For Ariadne, the labyrinth was not just a place of horror, but a place of transformation, a place where the true nature of her strength and resilience was revealed. In the quiet moments of the night, when the stars shone brightly above Naxos, Ariadne would sometimes think of the thread. She would remember the way it had seemed to glow in the darkness, a beacon of hope amidst the shadows of the labyrinth. She would remember the feeling of giving it to Theseus, of trusting him to follow it, to follow her heart. And though she knew the thread had led him away, she also understood that it had done what it was meant to do. It had shown the way, not just through the maze, but through the journey of life itself. Ariadne's thread, like the stories of the gods, was not linear. It did not follow a simple path. Instead, it wove through the tapestry of time, crossing paths with other threads, intertwining with the stories of others, and in doing so, creating something greater than any one individual could ever achieve. The gods, with their vast, unknowable designs, wove their own threads into the fabric of existence, each one pulling at the threads of others, creating a pattern that was at once chaotic and beautiful, random and inevitable. Ariadne, now among the stars, was a part of that vast tapestry. Her thread had been severed from Theseus, but it had been woven into the heavens, where it would forever shine as a symbol of her journey. The constellation of the crown, Corona Borealis, would forever remind the world of the woman who had guided a hero out of darkness, and who had, in turn, found her own light. Her story would live on, not just as a myth, but as a reminder that every thread in the tapestry of life is interconnected, that every path, no matter how winding or uncertain, is part of a greater whole. And so, the thread of Ariadne's life continued to weave, gently pulling the hearts of those who listened to her story and offering them the comfort of knowing that no matter the twists and turns, no matter the losses or the pain, there was always the possibility of a new beginning, of a new thread to follow. Ariadne, now part of the divine realm through her union with Dionysus, found herself embraced by a world beyond human comprehension. Naxos, Once her island of solitude and sorrow became a sacred place under her influence, a place where the very air seemed to hum with the energy of transformation. As the wife of the god of wine, celebration, and ecstasy, Ariadne's life took on a new depth, one filled with divine favor and the perpetual promise of renewal. Dionysus, with his carefree nature and wild spirit, was not a god known for structure or order. His was a world of excess, of revelry, of abandoning the constraints of society and allowing the soul to be freed. In this realm, Ariadne was not just a consort, but a partner, a queen in her own right. Together, they ruled not with laws or decrees, but with the intoxicating power of joy, the gift of liberation. Their dominion was one of celebration and release, a realm where the heart could dance unburdened by the weight of the world. Yet, even in this realm of divine joy, Ariadne's past was never far from her thoughts. She had been a mortal once. She had been a woman betrayed, abandoned by Theseus, who had left her behind on the shores of Naxos. That pain, that quiet ache, was not something easily erased. Even the stars above her, now her eternal companions, could not entirely remove the memory of her life before Dionysus. But in time, she came to understand that her past was not something to be discarded. It had been a part of her, just as the thread she had once given Theseus had been a part of her. That thread, that act of love, had brought her here, to this new life. Without it, there could be no rebirth, no transformation. And so, Ariadne embraced both her past and her present. She was no longer the abandoned princess of Crete, nor the woman who had been left to wander in grief. She had transcended that identity. Her love for Dionysus, which had once been gentle and hesitant, had blossomed into something powerful and profound. She was now a goddess of the vine, a goddess of transformation and the very essence of the beauty that arises from sorrow. Her laughter, her joy, filled the halls of the gods, and the earth below mirrored the abundance of the heavens. As her influence grew, so too did her role in the divine order. The gods, watching from their thrones, took note of the changes she had wrought. Dionysus, though often seen as a god of wild abandon, was no stranger to deep, meaningful bonds. He saw in Ariadne a soul whose strength could match his own, a presence that brought balance to the intoxication of his realm. Together, they were a perfect pair. He, the god of uninhibited freedom, and she, the goddess who had found her freedom through love, trust, and acceptance. It is said that Ariadne, now fully embraced by the divine world, had become a goddess of more than just revelry. She became a protector of those who had known betrayal, of those who had suffered in silence. She was the goddess who understood the pain of being left behind, but who had also learned to rise again. In her, the gods saw the fullness of life, the ebb and flow of joy and sorrow, the acceptance of both light and dark as necessary parts of the eternal dance of the universe. To the mortals who worshipped her, Ariadne was not just the goddess of wine and celebration. She became a symbol of transformation, of the strength to overcome hardship and emerge from it not broken, but renewed. Her name was invoked by those who faced difficult choices, by those who felt the weight of abandonment, and by those who needed guidance in times of confusion. They came to her not for promises of immortality or grandeur, but for the promise of inner strength, the strength to transform, to release, to find joy even in the darkest of times. Her influence was not confined to the gods alone. The mortal realm, too, felt the touch of her divine presence. It was said that those who found themselves lost in the labyrinths of their own lives could call upon Ariadne for guidance, just as Theseus had once called upon her for help. The labyrinth, in this sense, became a metaphor, a symbol of the struggles that everyone faces, a reminder that no matter how dark the path, there was always the possibility of finding a way out. And so, Ariadne's favour spread through the world. She became not just a goddess of the divine feast, but a goddess of the quiet moments as well, a protector of those whose lives seemed to be unravelling. To those who struggled with abandonment, with betrayal, with grief, she offered a gentle touch, a whisper in the heart, reminding them that they too could rise again, just as she had. In the halls of Olympus, where the gods dwelled in eternal harmony, Ariadne was a figure of balance. She was not the wild, untamed force of Dionysus, nor the rigid structure of Zeus. Instead, she was a presence that could bring peace to the most troubled soul, a reminder that even in the depths of despair, there was the possibility of light. Ariadne's favour was not just a gift to the gods or to mortals. It was a reminder to all who looked upon her story that no life was without its struggles, no journey without its dark moments. But it was also a reminder that, like her own journey, there was always the possibility of transformation. The labyrinth, once a symbol of fear and isolation, had become a symbol of hope and renewal. And so, the thread of Ariadne's influence continued to weave through the world, connecting all those who had known sorrow and all those who had sought a way out of their own labyrinths. Her story, once a tale of abandonment, had become a story of redemption, a story of the power of love and the strength that comes from embracing both the light and the dark within. As Ariadne's influence spread far and wide, her name became synonymous not only with the triumph of transformation, but with the intricate dance of life itself. She had come to embody the delicate balance between freedom and restraint, between joy and sorrow, between chaos and harmony. Her union with Dionysus, though born of passion, had become something greater, a divine partnership that illuminated the way for all those who sought meaning in the dance of existence. The eternal dance of the gods and mortals had long been woven with threads of tension and release, of beginnings and endings. To witness the world through Ariadne's eyes was to understand that the dance of life was not one of linear progression, but of cycles, the rise and fall, the ebb and flow, the coming together and falling apart. Ariadne, once the princess of Crete, who had been cast aside, now understood the rhythm of this dance with a depth few could fathom. She had witnessed its chaos, its beauty, and its inevitable return to balance. Through her, the gods of Olympus began to see the world in a new light, a light that was less about domination and more about flow, about allowing life to unfold without the need for control. In her divine realm with Dionysus, Ariadne's presence was a guiding force, not a command. Where Dionysus was the god of frenzy and release, Ariadne brought a sense of calm, a quiet wisdom that allowed all who entered her domain to experience not just the wild joy of the feast, but the deeper satisfaction that came from acceptance and transformation. Her dance, one of peace amidst the storm, became the symbol of resilience, the resilience to endure the trials of life and emerge from them not unscathed, but changed, and in that change, stronger. The mortal world, too, felt the ripple of Ariadne's influence. Her story, as it spread across the generations, became a beacon for those who sought guidance. The labyrinth, once the symbol of terror, now represented something else entirely. It was no longer just a maze of confusion and fear, but a place of growth. The labyrinth became a metaphor for the trials of life, the moments when one felt lost, when the way ahead seemed obscured by darkness. Yet, just as Theseus had found his way out of the labyrinth with Ariadne's thread, so too did mortals find their way through the difficulties of their own lives with the wisdom she now offered. Her story became a reminder that, even in the darkest times, there was a thread that could guide them through, if only they were willing to follow it. Ariadne's role as a goddess was not one of grandeur or pomp. She did not sit at the highest seat of Olympus, commanding the heavens as Zeus did. Instead, she had become a goddess of the quiet moments, the subtle changes that shifted the course of lives. It was said that her presence could be felt most strongly in moments of peace, in the quiet reflection of a soul coming to terms with its struggles, in the calm after the storm, in the moments between breath, when one recognized the deep pulse of life itself. Her dance was not the frantic, feverish whirl of the Bacchic revels, but the slow, graceful turn of one who had learned to move with the flow of existence rather than against it. Dionysus, her eternal partner, often led the wild, jubilant celebrations in their domain, where the gods and mortals alike would let go of their inhibitions and surrender to the freedom of the moment. But Ariadne, standing beside him, was the steadying force. She was the anchor in the storm, the thread of stability that tied all the revelry together. She understood that the joy of release, while profound, could not be sustained without the wisdom of knowing when to rest, when to reflect, and when to begin again. As the years passed, Ariadne's influence only grew, and her realm, one of endless celebration but also quiet understanding, became a refuge for all who sought solace. Those who were lost in their own personal labyrinths came to her, seeking the strength to transform, to break free from their own patterns of despair, of confusion. Her blessings were not those of grand miracles, but of the simple gift of perspective, the gift of seeing the way forward when all seemed shrouded in darkness. Her realm was where those who had suffered could come to shed their burdens, not through escape, but through acceptance. In this space, her presence was a silent dance of comfort. Mortals who had known the sting of abandonment, the weight of loss, found themselves reborn under her gaze. They did not need to forget their pasts, for Ariadne understood that the past was never truly gone. Instead, they learned to move forward, step by step, with a sense of inner peace, knowing that every part of their journey, even the most painful, had led them to this moment. Ariadne's dance was not just one of personal transformation, but one that mirrored the way the world itself moved. Just as the stars above Naxos seemed to twirl in their eternal paths across the night sky, so too did the lives of mortals dance in the great expanse of time. She had once been a part of that mortal dance, a princess cast adrift by fate. But now, as a goddess, she had learned to understand the rhythm of life. It was not about controlling the tempo, but about learning to move with it, gracefully, even through the hardest of times. Through her connection to Dionysus and the many mortals who sought her guidance, Ariadne's dance became eternal, a reminder that life, in all its chaos and beauty, was a constant, ever-shifting rhythm. The labyrinths of the world, those confusing, difficult paths, were always there, but they were no longer to be feared. Ariadne, with her thread of hope, had shown that there was always a way out, always a path forward, no matter how twisted or dark the journey seemed. She had danced through the labyrinth of her own life, and now she danced for all of humanity, a gentle guiding force in the great cosmic ballet. Though Ariadne had found a new home on Naxos, far from the labyrinth that had once bound her to Theseus, her journey was not one that could be severed from the past. The threads of her life, like those she had once woven for Theseus, were interconnected. They crossed paths, intertwined, and, sometimes, came full circle. The past, with all its pain and triumph, still lingered in the corners of her heart. And, as the years passed, she could not help but feel the pull of the place where her story had begun. Crete. Her memories of Crete were tinged with both light and shadow. It had been her home, the island that had given her birth, but it was also the place where she had been caught in the web of her father Minos's expectations, the place where the labyrinth had loomed over her life, its twists and turns a constant reminder of her place in a story she had not chosen. Yet, in that very labyrinth, Ariadne had found the courage to change her fate. She had offered the thread that had guided Theseus, and in doing so, she had unknowingly begun her own journey of transformation. As the goddess of renewal and rebirth, Ariadne had come to see the beauty in all things, even the darkest of her memories. And so, it was not with bitterness that she thought of Crete, but with a sense of quiet understanding. Crete was a part of her, just as the labyrinth was, just as Theseus had once been a part of her life. It was all part of the great dance of fate, a dance that could not be undone, only embraced. The time came then when Ariadne felt it was necessary to return. She did not return out of a need for closure, but out of a sense of peace. She had transformed, and she sought to return to the place where it all began, not to relive her past, but to honor it, to honor the woman she had been and the goddess she had become. Dionysus, ever supportive of his wife's journey, accompanied her. Though he was a god of wild celebration, he also understood the power of reflection, the need for one to honor their roots before they could fully soar. Together, they made the journey back to Crete, and the sight of the island as it rose from the sea stirred something deep within Ariadne's heart. Crete had changed, of course. Time had its way of softening the sharp edges of memory. The grandeur of Minos's palace, once a symbol of her imprisonment, now stood as a relic of history, a monument to the passage of time. The labyrinth, though still whispered about in hushed tones by the people, no longer held the same terror that it once had. The Minotaur was gone, and with it the fear that had once gripped her soul. Ariadne's return to Crete was not one of grand declarations or emotional confrontations. It was, instead, a quiet journey of reconciliation. She walked the shores, her steps tracing the very sands that had once known her sorrow. She visited the ruins of the palace, where her father's shadow had once loomed large, but now she saw it for what it truly was, a place of history, no longer one that could dictate her fate. In the silence of that place, Ariadne felt the weight of her past lift, as though the very land was releasing her from the ties that had once bound her. But it was not only the physical place of Crete that she sought to reconcile with. It was the memories, the emotions that had lingered within her, like echoes in the wind. Her father's coldness, the betrayal of Theseus, the sense of abandonment that had once consumed her. All of it had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She had transformed, and in her transformation, she found a quiet strength, one that allowed her to look upon her past without the bitterness that had once clouded her vision. Dionysus, ever the companion to Ariadne's journey, stood by her side as she walked through the island. He did not speak much, for there was no need for words. His presence was enough, a reminder that she was not alone, that even in the moments of quiet reflection, the gods were with her. Ariadne knew, as she stood upon the shores of Crete, that the past had shaped her, but it no longer held sway over her. She was no longer the abandoned princess. She was a goddess, a queen in her own right, and her place was among the stars. Her time on Crete was brief, but it was profound. When she left, it was not with a sense of finality, but with a sense of peace. She had come full circle, returning to the place of her origin, not to relive her past, but to embrace the woman she had become. In that embrace, she found the final piece of her transformation. The journey back to Naxos was a quiet one. The seas, once turbulent with her turmoil, now seemed calm, as though the waters themselves were honoring her transformation. The thread that Ariadne had once given Theseus, which had guided him out of the labyrinth, now seemed to guide her as well, not through the maze of the mortal world, but through the labyrinth of her own soul. She had found her way out, and in doing so had become something greater than she had ever imagined, a goddess who had woven her own fate, her own destiny. Ariadne's return to Crete was a reminder that, no matter where one began, it was not the beginning that defined them, but the journey itself. And in her journey, she had found her own strength, her own joy, and her own place in the world. Ariadne's return to Crete had marked a significant moment in her personal journey. No longer haunted by the labyrinth or the abandonment that had once defined her, she had left the island with a sense of peace that only time could provide. Her life, intertwined now with Dionysus, had flourished in a realm of joy, rebirth, and the exuberance of the divine. Together, they reigned over the realm of wine and celebration, a domain where all burdens could be released and the soul could dance freely in the ecstasy of life's fleeting moments. But there was another part of Ariadne's transformation that could not be ignored, one that had always been a part of her, though she had not yet fully realized its power: her connection to the vine, to the life-giving force of the earth itself. Though Ariadne was known as the goddess of transformation, of renewal, her role as the goddess of the vine, the one who nourished and sustained through the fruit of the earth, had deepened over time. It was through this connection to the vine that Ariadne's power truly began to flourish. The vine, which Dionysus had long held dominion over, was not just a symbol of revelry and excess. It was also a symbol of growth, of fertility, and of the deep connection between the divine and the mortal world. The vine grew slowly, weaving its way through the earth, drawing life from the soil and transforming it into something both beautiful and sustaining. In this, Ariadne saw the parallel to her own journey. Her own growth had been slow and steady, nurtured by the love of Dionysus, but also by her own resilience. She had been the vine that had wound its way through the labyrinth of her life, pulling herself from the dark depths of grief and abandonment, and into the light of self-acceptance. As Ariadne walked through the lush vineyards of Naxos, her heart was filled with a sense of quiet pride. The vines, heavy with their ripening fruit, seemed to echo her own journey. the slow but certain rise from the soil to the heavens. Dionysus, too, understood the deep significance of the vine. He had been the god who had brought the vine to life, and it was through this gift that the world was granted not only the joy of celebration, but the strength that came from the earth itself. The vine was a symbol of both life and death, of the eternal cycle of nature and of the transformation that took place each year as the vine was pruned and reborn. Together, Dionysus and Ariadne watched over the vineyards, ensuring that the earth remained fertile and that the vines grew strong. They understood that the blessings of the vine were not just for celebration, but for healing, for sustenance, for renewal. The vine offered nourishment not only to the body, but to the spirit as well. It was a gift to those who had known hardship, who had known the weight of the world on their shoulders. For those who were lost in the labyrinths of their own lives, the vine was a reminder that growth was always possible, that transformation was always within reach. In time, mortals began to come to Naxos, not only to celebrate, but to seek the blessings of the vine. They sought guidance from Ariadne, asking her to bless their vineyards, their crops, and their hearts. The land of Naxos became known not just as the place of Dionysian revelry, but as a place of healing, a place where the fruits of the earth could heal the soul. Ariadne's blessings were quiet, subtle, and deeply transformative. She did not promise immortality or escape from the struggles of life, but rather the strength to face those struggles with resilience and grace. To the women who came seeking her aid, Ariadne became a symbol of strength and resilience. She was the goddess who had faced abandonment, who had faced loss, and who had emerged from the darkness to find her place in the light. In her, they saw not just a goddess of the vine, but a goddess who had nurtured herself, who had allowed herself to grow and change, just as the vine grew, year after year. She reminded them that no matter how broken they felt, no matter how lost they seemed, they too could grow again. The earth, like the heart, was always capable of renewal. As the vines on Naxos flourished, so too did Ariadne's influence. The festivals in honor of Dionysus became even more vibrant, the celebrations more joyous. For the people understood that their revelry was not merely for the sake of indulgence, but a celebration of the life that flowed through the vine, the life that flowed through all of them. The vine was a symbol of connection, of the interconnectedness of all things, from the gods in their lofty halls to the mortals tending the earth. Dionysus, always the god of excess, took great joy in watching his wife's influence grow. He knew that their realms, though deeply entwined, were not the same. He reveled in the chaotic, uninhibited energy of the celebrations he oversaw. But he understood that it was Ariadne who brought the balance, who showed that the earth could be a source of both wild joy and quiet sustenance. Their union, once seen as one of mere passion and revelry, had deepened into something far more profound. It was a union of life itself, a reminder that life in all its forms required both light and shadow, both release and restraint. Together, they had woven a legacy of transformation, a legacy that would echo through the ages. The vine, with its deep roots and winding growth, became a symbol of all that Ariadne had endured and overcome. It became a reminder that no matter the storm, no matter the difficulty, there was always the possibility of growth, always the possibility of rebirth. Ariadne's role as the goddess of the vine had become as much a part of her as her transformation from mortal to divine. She had once been a woman lost in the labyrinth of her life, but now, like the vine that wound its way through the earth, she had found her place in the world, and in that place she had become a source of life and strength for all those who needed it. Ariadne's life, though once marked by sorrow and abandonment, had transformed into a symbol of deep connection, not just to the earth, but to the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Her influence, ever present on Naxos and beyond, was felt by those who came to seek her blessings, as well as by the very land itself. The vines, which she had come to embody, grew not just in the soil, but in the hearts of those who believed in the power of renewal. As the goddess of transformation, Ariadne was a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. She had once been a mortal woman, caught in the threads of fate, but now she stood as a testament to what could be achieved through resilience and grace. Her story, the story of her abandonment, her journey of loss and healing, and her eventual rise to divinity, became one that spoke to the hearts of those who sought meaning in their own lives. Through her, they learned that no matter how far one might fall, there was always a way to rise again. It was said that those who came to Naxos seeking guidance could feel the weight of Ariadne's presence, even without speaking her name. The land itself seemed to respond to her. The air was thick with the scent of blooming vines, and the earth hummed with the quiet power of transformation. In the vineyards, where Dionysus's revelries once reigned, there was now a calm, a peace that balanced the exuberance of the god of wine with the quiet joy of growth. Ariadne's connection to the vine became the key to her growing influence. She was not just the goddess who presided over the vine's fruit, but the one who understood the deep connection between the earth and the heavens, between the fleeting moments of joy and the eternal cycle of life. The vine, with its twisting branches and ripening fruit, was both a symbol of life's potential and of life's fragility. The vines needed care, they needed patience, and they needed the right balance of light and shadow to thrive. In the same way, Ariadne had learned to care for herself, to nurture her heart, to give herself the light of love and the shadow of reflection. She had come to understand that both were necessary for growth. Though Dionysus often ruled with wild abandon, Ariadne's wisdom had brought an essential balance to their world. The celebratory feasts, the great revels, and the ecstatic dances were all important. But Ariadne had shown that they could not exist without reflection, without the quiet moments between the bursts of joy. It was in these quiet moments that one truly understood the depth of their experiences, and it was in these moments that Ariadne found herself most alive. For those who came to seek her guidance, Ariadne's blessing was not just a gift of the vine, but a gift of understanding. She did not promise immortality or escape from hardship. Instead, she offered them the understanding that all things, even the most painful of experiences, could lead to growth. Her role as the goddess of the vine became a metaphor for life itself. Every season brought its own challenges, but every season also brought its own renewal. She was a constant reminder that the darkest days were always followed by the light, that from the most barren of winters, the spring would always return. In the quiet corners of Naxos, beneath the boughs of the great vines, mortals would often gather to pray to her. Some came to ask for blessings on their harvests, others to seek solace from the wounds of their hearts. Some came to ask for strength, others for guidance through their personal labyrinths. Ariadne, though she did not speak in the ways that mortals understood, responded with the quiet comfort of the land itself. The flourishing vines, the fruit ripening on the branches, the earth that fed them all. She reminded them that growth took time, and that, like the vine, they too had the potential to reach great heights, to stretch toward the sun and bear fruit, no matter the darkness of the past. Her connection to the vine was not limited to Naxos. It spread across the lands of Greece and beyond, as her name was whispered in prayers to ask for strength and resilience. The vine, with its fruit and its branches, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that no matter how difficult the journey, transformation was always possible. Ariadne's own transformation was the greatest proof of this. From the abandoned princess of Crete, whose heart had been broken by Theseus, to the goddess who had found love and strength in the arms of Dionysus, she had become a symbol of the power of love, of resilience, and of the endless possibilities of life. She had walked through the darkness, faced her fears, and emerged into the light, not as a victim, but as a woman who had become her own goddess. Though Ariadne had once given Theseus the thread to guide him out of the labyrinth, it was now clear that it had been she who had found the way out of her own labyrinth. The thread she had offered had been a symbol of hope, of the connection between them, but in the end, it was the thread of her own life that had guided her to her true purpose. The labyrinth, once a place of confusion and fear, had become a place of growth, a place where Ariadne had come to understand that the greatest journey was not through the maze, but through the heart. In her union with Dionysus, Ariadne had found peace, a peace that had been born from the transformation of her own heart. Together, they ruled over the realm of joy and ecstasy, but it was Ariadne's wisdom that provided the balance. She had learned, over the course of her journey, that true transformation came not from escape, but from the understanding that every part of the journey, every twist of fate, had led her to this point. And so, Ariadne's blessings continued to ripple through the world, not just through the harvests of the earth, but through the hearts of those who had learned from her. She became a living reminder that no matter how lost one might feel, there was always a way forward, always the possibility of growth. The labyrinths of life would continue to twist and turn, but with her blessing, the way out would always be found. As the years passed, Ariadne's influence grew ever stronger. Her role as the goddess of transformation and the vine was etched into the fabric of the world itself, where her name became a quiet prayer whispered by those seeking strength through adversity. Though the seasons of the earth continued to shift, Ariadne's presence remained constant, a guiding force for both the earth's growth and the hearts of those who walked its soil. Her connection to the vine, the deep, nurturing roots of the earth, was no fleeting thing. The vine had long been a symbol of Dionysus, and now it had come to represent the eternal balance of life and death, joy and sorrow, beginning and end. As the vine grew, it was pruned and reborn, season after season, never ceasing in its constant cycle of regeneration. Ariadne, too, had come to embody this eternal cycle. Like the vine, she had grown from her struggles, had shed her old self to reveal a new, stronger version of her being. It was said that in the quiet moments of reflection, when the stars hung in the deep sky above Naxos, Ariadne would sometimes think about time, how it moved like the slow, unceasing rhythm of the seasons, how it shaped and moulded the lives of both mortals and gods. She had once been a woman trapped in the labyrinth of her own heart, but now she stood among the stars, her constellation shining as a beacon of hope for those who might follow. She had come full circle, having faced her fears, overcome her heartbreak, and embraced the divine transformation that awaited her. Though the passage of time had granted her wisdom, it also reminded her of the fleeting nature of existence. The vines she tended, though ever growing, would one day wither, only to be reborn. The seasons would change, and so too would the lives of the mortals who called upon her. But in this very impermanence there was beauty. Life, Ariadne knew, was not defined by its permanence, but by the moments of growth, of change, and of transformation. And just as the vine needed to be pruned to grow, so too did the soul need hardship to find its strength. In her realm with Dionysus, where the celebrations never ceased, Ariadne found herself contemplating not just the joy of revelry, but the deeper meaning behind it. The wild dances and drunken feasts were, in their essence, a release, a letting go of the burdens that weighed down the soul. And in that release, there was always the potential for renewal. But renewal was not just about escaping the pain of life. It was about understanding it, embracing it, and transforming it into something more. Ariadne, who had once been consumed by her grief, now understood that true renewal came from within, from the ability to grow through pain and to find the strength to rise again. And so, as the seasons turned on Naxos, Ariadne's life became a reflection of the cycles of the earth. The vineyard that flourished beneath her watch was a symbol of her own journey, growing, being pruned, and blossoming again. The vines seemed to mirror the course of her life. The winding, twisting paths that had once seemed so confusing now laid out before her as part of a greater design. She had not just overcome her past, she had integrated it, woven it into the fabric of her being, and in doing so, had become a part of the great, unending cycle of life. The goddess's role had shifted over time. She had once been a figure of grief, of loss, and of abandonment. But now she was a goddess of hope, a quiet force that helped the world understand that transformation was not only possible, but essential. In her, the mortals saw the power of resilience, the ability to rise above hardship and emerge as something new. Her story was no longer one of tragedy alone, but one of strength and renewal. And it was this story that she shared with the world, not through words, but through her very existence. As the years unfolded, those who came to Naxos seeking her blessings began to speak of her differently. They no longer saw her as just the goddess of vines or of revelry. They saw her as a goddess of patience, of quiet growth, and of the understanding that every moment, whether of joy or sorrow, was a part of the greater cycle. Her role was not to grant immortality or avoid the inevitable passage of time, but to guide those who sought her wisdom toward embracing the flow of life with all its twists and turns. There were those who would come to Naxos seeking answers, looking for a way to escape the passage of time, to preserve their lives in a state of unchanging perfection. Ariadne did not give them such answers. Instead, she gave them the understanding that it was the changes, the inevitable passage of time, that made life worth living. The fleeting moments of happiness, the brief periods of joy, were precious, not because they lasted forever, but because they did not. It was the impermanence of life that made it beautiful, that made it worth living. And Ariadne, in her quiet way, helped those who came to her understand that. Her blessings were not about holding on to what was lost, but about finding the courage to let go. The vine, after all, could not grow without the shedding of old leaves, the pruning of dead branches. And so too could the soul not grow without the shedding of past hurts, without the acceptance that everything in its time must change. Ariadne's own journey had been one of constant transformation, from abandoned princess to divine queen, from mortal sorrow to eternal wisdom. And in this journey, she had come to understand that the passing of time was not an enemy to be fought, but a companion to be embraced. It was time that had shaped her, time that had guided her, and time that would continue to weave its way through the lives of mortals and gods alike. Ariadne, now a goddess of the vine and transformation, stood as a reminder that no matter how much time passed, the potential for renewal was always present. Every season, no matter how difficult, would eventually give way to a new beginning. As the centuries passed, the story of Ariadne's journey became enshrined in the minds of those who believed in the gods. Mortals who turned their gaze toward the heavens saw the constellation Corona Borealis, the crown of stars that marked her place among the divine, a symbol of her transformation from a forsaken princess to the goddess of renewal. But despite her divine status, despite the peace and joy she had brought to the world, the labyrinth of her past never truly faded from her memory. The labyrinth, that dark, twisting maze, remained a part of Ariadne's story. It had been the place of her greatest challenge, the birthplace of her courage, and the crucible in which she had first found the strength to defy fate. Though she had long left the halls of Crete behind, the labyrinth continued to echo in her soul. Even in her divine form, as she stood among the stars, Ariadne never forgot the place where her journey had truly begun. Ariadne knew that the labyrinth, in a sense, was never just a physical space. It was a symbol of the struggles she had faced within herself, the confusion, the grief, and the fear that had once threatened to consume her. The labyrinth had been a mirror to her soul, a place where every turn she made had seemed to lead her deeper into darkness. But it had also been the place where she had found her courage, where she had found the strength to act, to offer the thread, to change the course of her own life and that of Theseus. It was true, of course, that Theseus had escaped the labyrinth with her thread. It was true that he had defeated the Minotaur, ending the curse that had plagued Crete for so long. But Ariadne had learned, in the quiet moments of reflection, that the labyrinth had never been just about Theseus. It had always been about her. It had been her heart, her mind, that had been the real maze. And in guiding him out, she had found the strength to guide herself out of her own inner labyrinth. The labyrinth was not something to be forgotten or erased, Ariadne had realized. It was something to be understood. It was the crucible in which she had forged her strength. The dark passages, the looming shadows, they had shaped her, had led her to become the woman, the goddess she was now. The maze, once a place of fear, had become a place of growth. And in that growth, Ariadne had come to understand that the labyrinth of the heart was a place all people must navigate. The struggles, the confusion, the pain, they were a part of life. But they were also the necessary ingredients for transformation. As the goddess of transformation, Ariadne often found herself surrounded by those who came to her seeking guidance. These were mortals who, like her, had faced their own labyrinths, their own struggles with loss, with confusion, and with the shadows of the past. And just as she had once offered Theseus the thread to guide him through the maze, she now offered that same thread to those who sought her aid. The thread was no longer just a symbol of escape. It was a symbol of connection, a reminder that even in the most confusing of times, there was always a way forward, always a path to be found. For Ariadne, the labyrinth had ceased to be a place of darkness. It had become a place of understanding. The twisting corridors, the uncertainty, the feeling of being lost, these were all a part of the journey. It was in the labyrinth that she had discovered the depth of her own courage, her own will to act. And it was in the labyrinth that she had learned the most important lesson of all, that true transformation does not come from avoiding the darkness, but from moving through it. The labyrinth, in its many forms, continued to exist in the hearts of those who walked the earth. It was a metaphor, a symbol for the internal struggles that every mortal would face in their lifetime. And just as Ariadne had found her way through it, so too would others. The labyrinth was a part of her, just as the thread was. They were inseparable, the darkness and the light, the challenge and the triumph. Ariadne, now a goddess, could look upon the labyrinth with new eyes. She no longer saw it as a place of fear. Instead, she saw it as a place of possibility. For every mortal who entered a labyrinth, there was the chance for transformation. And the thread of hope, of connection, of guidance, would always be there, waiting to be offered. And so, the memory of the labyrinth lived on, not just in the past, but in the present, in every soul who faced a challenge, who stood at the entrance of their own labyrinth and wondered how they would find their way. Ariadne, from her place among the stars, continued to offer her guidance. Through her, the labyrinth became something not to fear, but to embrace. For it was through the labyrinth, through the twists and turns of life, that one would always find their way, eventually through the thread of their own strength, through the quiet power of transformation. Ariadne's divine nature had become, in part, a reflection of her mortal journey. She had learned that the darkness was not to be avoided, but understood, that it was through the labyrinth that true wisdom came. And now, she was the goddess who helped others walk through their own labyrinths, guiding them not with magic or force, but with the quiet presence of a soul that had once been lost, but had found its way. Ariadne's story, woven from the threads of her past, had become a tapestry of resilience, transformation, and quiet wisdom. In the halls of Olympus, she stood as a goddess not of great power or dominion, but of understanding, of patience, and of the deep wisdom that only comes with embracing one's full journey. Though she had ascended from her mortal roots, her connection to humanity, to the struggles of those who walked the earth, remained strong. She had once been caught in the winds of fate, tossed between the hands of those who would use her and those who would leave her behind. Yet, as a goddess, she had come to understand the value of those very struggles. Through her union with Dionysus, the god of wine, joy, and revelry, she had learned the importance of balancing the exuberance of life with its inevitable ebb and flow. Together, they ruled over a world of celebration, where joy and sorrow intermingled, where the wild dance of life was celebrated, but also reflected upon. Ariadne's influence on the mortal world, however, was subtle. She did not demand worship in the way that other gods did. She was not a goddess to be called upon in times of war or conflict, but one who was sought in times of change, when the weight of the world pressed upon a person's heart, or when they needed guidance in navigating the labyrinths of their own soul. To invoke Ariadne was to seek the quiet strength to endure, to understand that even the darkest paths could lead to light. As the goddess of the vine, she symbolized both the freedom of the Bacchic revels and the patience of the earth itself. The vine was a living embodiment of the earth's cycles, the passing of seasons, the growth of life, the falling of leaves, and the eventual rebirth. The wine it bore was not just a drink of celebration, it was a drink of remembrance, a drink that reminded mortals of the impermanence of all things and the beauty that could be found in even the most fleeting moments. Ariadne understood this duality of existence, the harmony between the divine and mortal realms, between joy and sorrow, between light and dark. In her own life, she had felt both extremes. As a mortal, she had suffered heartbreak, abandonment, and loss. But through these trials, she had learned to see the world in a new way. The labyrinth of her life had not been a place of endless confusion, but a place where she had found her true self. It was through her connection to the mortal world that she had discovered the divine within herself. Her story, then, was not just one of escape or of triumph, but of integration. She had learned to integrate her mortal struggles with her divine purpose. Just as the vine integrated the cycles of the seasons, the spring of new growth, the summer of abundance, the fall of harvest, and the winter of rest, so too did Ariadne integrate her own experiences. Her heart, once broken, had become a vessel of understanding, a guide for those who sought the path of transformation. Dionysus, her eternal companion, played a central role in this dance of life. Though he was known for his wild, uninhibited spirit, it was Ariadne who brought balance to their realm. His revels were filled with chaos and joy, but it was Ariadne's presence that ensured there was harmony beneath the surface. Together, they created a realm where joy could be found in every moment, but where there was also space for reflection and renewal. The gods, watching from their thrones, saw the unique role Ariadne played in the world. She was not a goddess of battles or grand feats of strength, but of the quiet moments that brought about true change. She was a reminder that transformation did not always come in dramatic bursts, but in the slow, steady shifts that occurred over time. The vine did not grow overnight, nor did the heart's transformation happen in an instant. But with patience, with understanding, and with time, both would flourish. For those who came to her, Ariadne offered not a promise of immediate answers, but a gift of perspective. She showed them that their struggles, no matter how difficult, were a part of their own transformation. She taught them that there was no need to rush through life, no need to escape the inevitable cycles of change. Instead, she encouraged them to embrace those changes, to find peace in the quiet moments of transition, and to trust that the path, no matter how twisted it seemed, would eventually lead to a place of light. Her role in the mortal realm was one of quiet guidance. The people of Naxos, once simply followers of Dionysus, came to see Ariadne in a new light. She was not just the goddess who had given her love to a hero, nor the wife of the god of revelry. She was a goddess of transformation, a figure who helped mortals navigate the trials of life with grace. The vineyards that flourished under her care became symbols of that transformation, a reminder that even in the darkest seasons there was always the promise of renewal. Ariadne's story, once one of abandonment and heartbreak, had become a story of wholeness. She had learned that in order to truly transform, one had to embrace all parts of themselves, the light and the dark, the joy and the sorrow. She was a goddess, not just of the vine, but of the human experience itself. And as such, her presence was felt by all who sought her wisdom. Whether they came in the heat of summer, when the vines bore their fruit, or in the chill of winter, when the earth rested, Ariadne was there, a constant, quiet presence, guiding them through the labyrinth of life. The harmony she created between the divine and the mortal was her greatest gift. In her, the world found balance, the balance between chaos and order, between celebration and reflection, between the fleeting and the eternal. She had become a goddess not just of the heavens, but of the earth itself, of the rhythms that governed life, and of the quiet strength that could be found in every season of the soul. As Ariadne's story continued to unfold, the full weight of her transformation became clear not only in the heavenly realms, but in the hearts of mortals. Those who had once known her as the abandoned Princess of Crete now saw her as a symbol of rebirth, strength, and patience. They came to understand that the divine and the mortal, joy and sorrow, past and future, were all part of the same great cosmic dance, a dance that was forever unfolding and ever evolving. Ariadne's life, which had once seemed so full of loss and abandonment, was now a celebration of the eternal cycle of change. The story of her transformation from a forsaken princess to a goddess of rebirth was one of profound meaning, and she became a beacon of hope for those who had known their own trials. Through her, they saw that no matter how painful or dark the journey, there was always the possibility of new beginnings. It was in the quiet moments that Ariadne found the deepest meaning, in the spaces between the revels, in the stillness of the vineyards, and in the quiet reflections beneath the stars. Though she stood as a divine figure, there was a sense of humanity about her that touched the hearts of those who came seeking her wisdom. She had once been a mortal, after all, and it was this shared understanding of the human experience that allowed her to guide others so effectively. In her union with Dionysus, the god of revelry and intoxication, Ariadne had learned that true joy was not something that could be forced or manufactured. It arose naturally, like the vine that grew freely through the earth, nourished by the sun and rain. And just as the vine needed both light and shadow, so too did joy need the balance of sorrow, for it was through the contrast that its beauty was truly revealed. Life, like the vine, was about growth, not just growth in the light, but growth through the challenges, the trials, and the moments of hardship. Ariadne's connection to the vine symbolized this very balance. She understood that the vine could not flourish without being pruned, without going through the natural cycles of growth and rest. Similarly, humans could not grow without facing their own personal labyrinths, their own struggles. But in that very struggle, there was the potential for renewal, for transformation, and for a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them. The celebrations in honor of Dionysus where the gods and mortals alike let go of their burdens and gave in to the joy of life, had always been a place of freedom. But it was Ariadne who had shown that such freedom was not simply about release. It was about finding harmony between the spirit and the body, between the temporary ecstasy of the moment and the lasting peace of understanding one's place in the great cycles of life. Her role, as both a goddess of joy and of quiet reflection, was one of deep significance. She had become a mediator between the two extremes, teaching the world that true happiness came from within, from the acceptance of the fullness of life. Whether in the exuberant revelry of a festival or in the stillness of a quiet night under the stars, Ariadne's presence was a reminder that everything was connected. The joy of the revelers was not separate from the sorrow of the heart. They were two sides of the same coin, and both were necessary for the soul's growth. The vine, which Ariadne had come to embody, grew through the soil, reaching up toward the sky. It was a symbol of the soul's journey, a journey that required both the grounding roots of experience and the open spaces of possibility. Ariadne's guidance allowed mortals to understand that the key to true transformation lay in finding a balance between these two forces, to embrace the challenges that life offered, to grow through them, and to find joy not in escape, but in understanding and integration. And so, Ariadne's legacy continued to unfold, not as a single story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, but as an ongoing journey, a journey of becoming. She had once been caught in the labyrinth of her own heart, but she had emerged stronger and wiser to guide others through their own labyrinths. The memory of her struggles, her triumphs, and her eventual transformation remained etched in the hearts of those who invoked her name. The seasons passed, and Ariadne's influence grew ever more powerful. The vineyards she had blessed flourished, and the wine that flowed from the earth became a symbol of life's eternal cycle. Her presence in the world was like the steady rhythm of the vine, always growing, always changing, but always rooted in the same deep understanding of the connection between all things. She had become not only a goddess of transformation, but a goddess of understanding, a figure who could see the divine in the most ordinary of things and help others to do the same. Her story was one of endings and beginnings, of cycles within cycles, of life that continually renewed itself. Ariadne's story was not just one of individual triumph, but one that echoed through the hearts of all who sought the path of transformation. She had become a symbol of the eternal dance between joy and sorrow, between the light and the dark, and through her mortals learned that the greatest power lay not in escaping the challenges of life, but in embracing them, knowing that each challenge, each twist of fate was an opportunity to grow, to change, and to become something greater. The vine, like the heart, was always reaching upward, always seeking the light, even when it was hidden beneath the clouds. And Ariadne, through her quiet wisdom, had become that light for all who sought it, guiding them not out of the labyrinth, but through it, step by step, with patience, grace, and the deep knowledge that transformation was never truly complete. It was always unfolding, always becoming, like the vine that grew, year after year, always reaching for the sun. And so, Ariadne's story, once marked by abandonment, loss, and sorrow, has become one of transformation, renewal, and understanding. She has transcended her past, not by forgetting it, but by embracing it as a part of the eternal cycle of life. Her journey, from the labyrinth of confusion and grief to the stars above, is a reminder to us all that no matter how twisted the path, no matter how dark the road, there is always the possibility of new beginnings. Ariadne's legacy is woven into the very fabric of the world, in the vines that grow, in the cycles of the seasons, in the quiet moments between joy and sorrow. Her divine wisdom, her strength, and her ability to guide others through their own labyrinths have made her a goddess not only of the heavens, but of the human spirit. She shows us that growth and change are not just inevitable, but necessary, that we too can rise from our struggles, our moments of pain, to become something new, something greater. The labyrinth, once a place of fear and confusion, has become a symbol of growth, a reminder that it is not the struggle that defines us, but how we move through it. With every twist, every turn, there is always the potential for transformation, for the emergence of a new self. And in this, Ariadne offers us a thread, not just of escape, but of hope, a thread that leads us through our challenges, our uncertainties, and into the light of self-discovery. As we close the story of Ariadne, we are reminded that our own journeys are not defined by the destinations we reach, but by the paths we walk, the lessons we learn, and the courage we find to face the unknown. The thread that Ariadne once offered to Theseus continues to offer hope to all who seek it. In every new beginning, in every act of renewal, the legacy of Ariadne lives on. Let her story remind us all that no labyrinth is too deep, no darkness too overwhelming. The way forward is always there, just waiting to be found, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. May you too find your way through the labyrinths of your own life, guided by the light of transformation, and may you always remember that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of growth, of change, and of rebirth. Thank you for joining in this journey through the myth of Ariadne. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from. May the thread of hope always guide you.